In the next 2 hours, you'll discover the man behind the legend. Napoleon Bonaparte reveals why he truly believes he was Europe's saviour, not its destroyer. You'll hear him break down as he speaks about his final exile, laugh about his supposed height complex, and rage about the betrayals that cost him everything. Tonight, the Emperor himself tells you what it feels like to hold the fate of nations in your hands, and why he'd do it all again. Like this video if you're genuinely enjoying it, and subscribe for more groundbreaking conversations with history's most fascinating figures. Which historical figure would you most want to share tea with? Drop your answer below. I read every comment from fellow history lovers like you, and your suggestions inspire future episodes. Now let me hand you over to Olivia, who's travelled back in time to the gilded chambers of Malmaison, where Napoleon sits by the fire, shadows dancing across his weathered face. So dim your lights, get comfortable, and close your eyes. This is Tea with Tyrants and Heroes.
Now Napoleon, the name of this show is Tea with Tyrants and Heroes, so I have to ask you directly. Do you consider yourself a tyrant or a hero? And I want you to really justify your answer. Don't give me the easy response. Tell me why you believe that about yourself.
Mon Dieu, what a question to begin with. You ask me to bare my soul immediately, don't you? Very well, I shall give you the truth, not the propaganda my enemies have spread across Europe like a plague. I am a hero, not because I conquered half the world. Any fool with enough cannon can conquer territory. I am a hero because I saved France from itself, and I gave Europe something it had never known, the possibility of true equality under law. When I took power, France was bleeding to death. The revolution had devoured its own children. The streets ran red with the blood of nobles and commoners alike, and the very concept of civilized society was crumbling. The Directory, corrupt fools who cared more for their own purses than the people they claimed to serve. I didn't seize power. I rescued it from incompetents who were driving the greatest nation on earth into the abyss. You call me a tyrant. I gave France the Code Civil, a legal system so brilliant that it still governs half the world today. I opened careers to talent, not birth. A peasant's son could become a marshal of France under my rule. Can you say the same of the Bourbon kings, of the Austrian emperors, of the British lords who sent their own people to die in factories whilst they counted their profits? Every war I fought was defensive. Yes, defensive. The old monarchies of Europe couldn't stomach the idea that merit might triumph over breeding. They formed coalition after coalition to destroy everything the revolution had achieved. They wanted to restore the Bourbon parasites and chain the French people back to their plows and their altars. I merely prevented them from doing so. But I'll tell you what truly makes me a hero. I believed in the power of human greatness. I saw potential in every soldier, every citizen, every conquered territory. I didn't just conquer, I liberated. I brought roads, schools, hospitals, and hope to lands that had known only feudal oppression. The Code Napoleon, the Concordat, the university system, these weren't the works of a tyrant. They were the gifts of a man who understood that true power lies not in destroying, but in building something that outlasts your own mortality. The English call me a tyrant because I threatened their precious balance of power, their system of keeping Europe weak and divided, whilst they grew fat on trade and slavery. The Russians call me a tyrant because I dared to challenge their divine right to rule over serfs like cattle. The Austrians call me a tyrant because I proved that a man of genius could outmaneuver 1,000 years of Habsburg mediocrity. History will vindicate me. It already has. Every time a common man rises by his own merit, every time justice is served equally regardless of birth, every time a nation chooses progress over tradition, my spirit triumphs. I am not just a hero of France, I am a hero of human potential itself.
That's not what I expected at all. The passion in your voice when you speak about human potential, it's quite moving. But since we're sharing tea together, do you actually like English tea?
English tea? It's swill. Give me proper French coffee any day.
I can hear the disdain in your voice. But speaking of English propaganda, let's address the elephant in the room. The British spent decades mocking your height. How did that actually affect you?
Ah, you want to discuss my height? Finally, someone asks me directly instead of whispering behind my back. This obsession with my stature tells you everything you need to know about my enemy's desperation. First, let me correct the record. I was 5 feet 7 inches tall. In my time, that was perfectly average, even slightly above average for a Frenchman. The confusion comes from the difference between French and English measurements. But why would the English care about accuracy when a lie serves their purpose better? But you ask how it affected me. I'll tell you something profound. It made me realize that when you cannot attack a man's achievements, you attack his person. When you cannot defeat his ideas, you mock his appearance. The Duke of Wellington never had to endure cartoons about his nose. Nelson was never ridiculed for his missing arm. But me? They had to invent a physical flaw because they couldn't diminish my actual accomplishments. Did it hurt? In the beginning, yes. I was human, after all. When I first saw those English caricatures showing me as a tiny man in an enormous hat, I felt the sting of humiliation. But then I understood. They were afraid. They were so terrified of what I represented that they had to make me seem smaller than life, because the truth was too threatening. The irony is delicious. While they drew me as a dwarf, I was reshaping the map of Europe. While they mocked my stature, I was elevating the common man to heights of glory they'd never imagined. While they joked about my size, I was thinking bigger than any monarch who had ever lived. You know what truly amusing? Some of the tallest kings in history achieved nothing worth remembering. Louis XVI was tall, and look how that ended for him. The Tsar Alexander was imposing in stature, and I chased him all the way to Moscow. Physical height means nothing when you lack the height of vision, the height of ambition, the height of genius. I learned to use their mockery as fuel. Every cartoon, every joke, every whispered comment about the little Corsican only proved that I loomed larger in their minds than any physical giant ever could. They made me small in their pictures because I was too large for their comprehension. And now I am immortal. In 200 years, people still speak my name with awe. Children learn about my battles, my laws, my empire. Meanwhile, the tall English lords who mocked me are forgotten dust. Tell me, who truly stands taller in history's judgment?
The way you turned that pain into fuel, there's something almost tragic about it. But that leads me to wonder, did you ever feel lonely being the smartest person in the room?
Lonely? Mon Dieu, you've touched upon the great curse of my existence. Yes, I was lonely, profoundly, devastatingly lonely, in ways that no ordinary person can comprehend. Imagine, if you will, being surrounded by thousands of people every day, yet feeling as isolated as a man stranded on a desert island. That was my reality. I could see solutions to problems that baffled my greatest ministers. I could envision military strategies that my most experienced generals couldn't grasp until I explained them 3 times. I could understand the economic consequences of political decisions that escaped my most educated advisors. It wasn't arrogance, though I know that's what they called it. It was simple, observable fact. When we discussed the continental system, I could see 5 moves ahead while they struggled with the first. When we planned campaigns, I was already calculating the supply lines for battles that wouldn't be fought for months. When we negotiated treaties, I understood the psychological motivations of my opponents better than they understood themselves. Do you know what it's like to be constantly surrounded by people who think at half your speed? To have to simplify your ideas into digestible pieces because the full complexity would overwhelm them? To bite your tongue when someone proposes a solution you can immediately see will fail, but you must let them reach that conclusion themselves or risk being called a tyrant. My marshals were brave men, loyal men, but they were not intellectuals. They could execute my plans brilliantly, but they couldn't conceive them. My ministers were educated, but their education was narrow, specialized. They knew law or finance or administration, but they couldn't see how all these pieces fit together into the grand design of civilization itself. And my wives? Josephine was charming, beautiful, sophisticated, but she couldn't follow my thoughts when I spoke of reshaping Europe. She cared about fashion and parties and society gossip. Marie-Louise was sweet, dutiful, well-educated for a woman of her station, but she was terrified of the scope of my ambitions. She wanted a quiet husband who would tend his garden and play with his children, not a man who dreamed of unifying the continent under rational principles. The loneliness was crushing. I would lie awake at night, my mind racing with possibilities, with plans, with visions of what Europe could become, and I had no one to share these thoughts with, no one who could understand the weight of responsibility I carried, the complexity of the decisions I faced, the beauty of the world I was trying to create. Sometimes I would walk through the gardens at Malmaison, and I would feel like I was the only person truly alive in a world of sleepwalkers. They were all playing their small roles, soldier, minister, courtier, wife, whilst I was trying to conduct the entire symphony of human progress. Even my enemies understood me better than my allies in some ways. Metternich, Wellington, Talleyrand, they were worthy opponents because they could at least glimpse the scale of what I was attempting. They feared me because they recognized something in me that my own supporters often missed. The tragedy is that the very qualities that made me great, the ability to see patterns others missed, to think several steps ahead, to understand the interconnectedness of all things, these same qualities condemned me to a kind of intellectual solitude that was almost unbearable.
That isolation sounds almost unbearable. But when you mention Josephine, I can hear something change in your voice. What was it about her that captured your heart so completely?
Josephine. Even now, after everything, her name still does something to me. You want to know what captured my heart? It wasn't her beauty, though she was beautiful. It wasn't her charm, though she could enchant a room full of enemies. It was her mystery. When I first met her, I was this awkward young general, brilliant in war, but hopeless with women. I had spent my youth reading Caesar and Alexander, not learning to dance or flirt, and here was this goddess of Parisian society, this woman who had survived the terror, who moved through salons like she owned them, who had lovers and admirers and secrets I couldn't even imagine. She was everything I wasn't, graceful where I was blunt, sophisticated where I was earnest, mysterious where I was transparent. When she looked at me, I felt like she could see straight through to my soul, but I could never quite figure out what she was thinking. It drove me absolutely mad with desire. I wrote her letters that embarrass me now, passionate, desperate letters begging her to love me as much as I loved her. I wake filled with you. Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left no rest to my senses. Can you imagine? The man who would make kings tremble, reduced to writing poetry like a lovesick schoolboy. But she never quite gave herself to me completely, never. Even when we were married, even when I made her an empress, there was always part of her that remained untouchable. She had lovers. Yes, I knew about them. Everyone knew. My officers would look at me with pity, and I would pretend not to notice because acknowledging it would have destroyed me. The cruelest part was that I understood why she couldn't love me the way I loved her. I was too intense, too demanding, too overwhelming. I wanted to possess her completely, her thoughts, her heart, her very soul. But Josephine was like mercury. The tighter you tried to hold her, the more she slipped through your fingers. When I divorced her, long pause. That was the day I truly became a tyrant, because I betrayed my own heart for reasons of state. I needed an heir, a legitimate heir from a royal bloodline. Marie-Louise could give me that. But when I told Josephine, when I saw her face crumble, I think something in me died that day. She was gracious about it, of course. She always was gracious. She agreed to the divorce. She accepted her settlement. She even attended my wedding to Marie-Louise. But I could see the hurt in her eyes, the disappointment. I had become just another man who had used her and discarded her when she was no longer useful. The bitter irony is that I got my heir, my legitimate son, my dynastic marriage, and none of it mattered. My empire fell anyway. Marie-Louise abandoned me the moment I was exiled. But Josephine? She never spoke ill of me, never betrayed my secrets, never turned her back on me, even after I had broken her heart. I should have kept her. I should have said to hell with legitimacy and heirs and dynastic politics. I should have chosen love over empire. But I was too proud, too ambitious, too convinced that I could have everything I wanted if I just planned carefully enough. She died while I was on Elba, and I wasn't there to hold her hand. That knowledge will torment me for eternity. The woman who taught me how to love, and I wasn't there when she needed me most.
I can hear the pain in your voice when you speak of her. But speaking of decisions that torment you, the march to Moscow. Everyone says it was your greatest mistake. Do you agree?
Moscow, You ask me about Moscow as if it were some mad whim, some foolish adventure I embarked upon for glory. Let me tell you the truth about Moscow. It was the most carefully calculated decision of my entire career, and it failed not because it was wrong, but because I underestimated the depths of Russian barbarism. Alexander had broken the Treaty of Tilsit. Do you understand what that meant? We had agreed, 2 emperors, 2 men of honor, that Russia would maintain the continental system, would help me strangle British trade, would stand with France against the eternal enemy. But Alexander was weak, influenced by his advisors, seduced by British gold. He opened Russian ports to British ships, he imposed tariffs on French goods, he was preparing to stab me in the back. I had 2 choices: accept this betrayal and watch my entire European system collapse, or teach Alexander that treaties with Napoleon Bonaparte are not suggestions to be ignored when convenient. I chose to uphold the principles that had made me master of Europe. The invasion was planned with meticulous precision. I assembled the largest army in human history, 600,000 men from across Europe, not just French, but Germans, Italians, Poles, all united under my eagles. I calculated supplies, routes, weather patterns, Russian defensive capabilities. I studied every map, every intelligence report, every historical account of previous invasions. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. March quickly to Moscow, force a decisive battle, defeat the Russian army, occupy the ancient capital, and dictate terms to Alexander from the Kremlin itself. The Russians had never lost their capital. Surely they would sue for peace rather than see Moscow under foreign occupation. But I underestimated their capacity for self-destruction. What civilized nation burns its own capital rather than negotiate? What rational people destroy their own homes, their own churches, their own history rather than accept defeat? The Russians fought like barbarians, retreated like cowards, and when they could do neither, they burned everything rather than let me have it. Borodino was a victory. Make no mistake about that. I broke the back of the Russian army. I opened the road to Moscow. I proved that Russian soldiers died just as easily as any others when faced with French steel. But it was a hollow victory because the Russians cared nothing for the lives of their own men. They threw away 45,000 casualties as if they were poker chips. And Moscow, when I finally reached it, when I stood in the Kremlin where Ivan the Terrible had once ruled, I found nothing. An empty shell. The Russians had evacuated the entire population and then burned the city to deny it to me. They destroyed their own patrimony rather than let me govern it wisely. What was I supposed to do? Rule over ashes? Govern a graveyard? I waited for Alexander to come to his senses, to send envoys, to negotiate like a civilized human being. Instead, he hid in St. Petersburg whilst his people starved and his cities burned. The retreat was a nightmare, yes. The Russian winter, the Cossack raids, the breakdown of discipline, it was the closest I ever came to complete disaster. But even then, even in defeat, I was thinking of France, of Europe, of the future. I left the army to race back to Paris because I knew my enemies would see weakness and try to exploit it. Was it a mistake? Perhaps. But what was the alternative? Let Alexander break his word with impunity? Allow the continental system to collapse? Watch the old monarchies of Europe unite against everything I had built? Sometimes a leader must choose between certain gradual decline and a desperate gamble for ultimate victory. I chose the gamble. I lost, but I would rather fail attempting greatness than succeed at mediocrity.
The passion in your voice. It's clear you still believe in those decisions. But I have to ask about something that weighs on many leaders: the human cost. How do you live with the knowledge that millions died because of your wars?
How do I live with it? Mon Dieu, you ask me to open the deepest wound of my soul. You think I don't see their faces. You think I don't know their names. Every night, in my dreams, I am surrounded by the dead. French, Austrian, Prussian, Russian, it doesn't matter. They all look at me with the same question in their eyes. Was it worth it? I'll tell you something no historian has ever written, something I've never admitted to another living soul. After Borodino, I walked through the battlefield at dawn. The ground was carpeted with bodies, young men who had awakened that morning, thinking of their mothers, their sweethearts, their futures. I saw a French grenadier, couldn't have been more than 20, lying next to a Russian boy who looked even younger. The Russian had a letter clutched in his hand, probably from his family. The Frenchman still had his fingers wrapped around his musket. I knelt down between them and I wept, not for the victory, not for the glory, but for the waste. These boys had died for principles they barely understood in a war that could have been avoided if the old monarchies had simply accepted the new world I was trying to create. But here's what you must understand. I did not choose these wars, I inherited them. The moment I took power, the moment I dared to suggest that common men might rule themselves, that merit might triumph over birth, that the future might be different from the past, that moment I became a target. The crowned heads of Europe would never have let me live in peace. Every coalition they formed, every army they sent against France, every assassination plot they hatched, these forced my hand. I could have stayed in France, governed quietly, let the revolution die a slow death. But that would have betrayed everyone who had died for the principles of 1789. It would have meant that all the blood already spilled was for nothing. So yes, I bear responsibility for the deaths, but I also bear responsibility for the lives I saved. How many French peasants would have died in poverty and ignorance if I hadn't opened careers to talent? How many German serfs would have remained in bondage if I hadn't brought the Code Napoleon to their lands? How many Italian city-states would have continued their petty wars if I hadn't united them under rational government? The arithmetic of history is cruel. I killed thousands to save millions. I shed blood to end the greater bloodshed that would have continued for centuries under the old system. The monarchies of Europe had been slaughtering each other for 1,000 years before I was born. At least my wars had a purpose beyond family pride and territorial greed. But does that make it easier? Does that quiet the voices of the dead? No, nothing can. I am haunted by every decision that sent men to their deaths. I remember approving battle plans that I knew would cost thousands of lives. I remember ordering charges that I knew would orphan children and widow wives. The burden of command is that you must make these choices anyway. You must weigh the immediate suffering against the long-term benefit. You must sacrifice the few for the many, the present for the future. It is a kind of moral mathematics that would drive most men insane. I tell myself that I was building something magnificent, a Europe united under law, where talent mattered more than birth, where reason triumphed over superstition. I tell myself that the pain was temporary, but the progress would last forever. I tell myself that history will vindicate the sacrifices I demanded. But late at night, when I cannot sleep, when the weight of memory presses down on me like a physical thing, I wonder if I was simply a man who loved power more than he loved human life. And that thought terrifies me more than any enemy army ever could.
The vulnerability in your voice, it's heartbreaking. But speaking of betrayal, which cut deepest, was it Talleyrand's treachery that hurt the most?
Talleyrand, you want to know about betrayal? You want to understand what it feels like to be stabbed in the back by someone you trusted with your life, your empire, your very soul? Then let me tell you about Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, the most skilled diplomat in Europe, and the most faithless snake who ever drew breath. I made him. Do you understand that? When I found him, he was a broken-down bishop with a club foot and a reputation for changing sides with the wind. The revolution had stripped him of his titles, his wealth, his position. He was nothing, a clever exile with good manners and no principles. I gave him everything. I made him my foreign minister, my voice to the courts of Europe, my partner in reshaping the continent. And God, he was brilliant. The man could negotiate with the devil himself and come away with a favorable treaty. He had this way of making enemies believe they were getting exactly what they wanted, whilst actually surrendering everything I needed. He spoke 6 languages fluently, understood the psychology of every major leader in Europe, and could craft diplomatic solutions that seemed impossible. We worked together for years. Years. I trusted him with my deepest strategies, my most sensitive negotiations, my private thoughts about other leaders. He was the only man who could match my intellectual pace, who could understand the full scope of what I was trying to achieve. When I was planning the continental system, he was the one who showed me how to make it work diplomatically. When I needed to isolate Austria, he crafted the alliances that made it possible. But I should have known. I should have remembered that a man who betrays his king, his church, and his class will eventually betray anyone. The signs were there, his mysterious wealth, his careful neutrality in dangerous moments, his subtle suggestions that perhaps I was being too aggressive, too ambitious. The final betrayal came when I needed him most, after the disaster in Russia, when the coalition was forming against me, when I needed every ally I could find. That's when he chose to abandon me, not openly, of course. Talleyrand was too clever for that. He began working secretly with the allies, feeding them information about my plans, my weaknesses, my desperate situation. At the Congress of Vienna, while I was fighting for my life at Leipzig, he was there representing the interests of France, meaning the interests of the Bourbons who wanted to restore the old regime. He helped craft the very treaties that would dismember my empire and restore the parasitic monarchies I had spent my life trying to destroy. The personal betrayal was devastating, but what made it unforgivable was that he betrayed everything we had built together. All those years of work, all those careful negotiations, all that progress toward a rational Europe, he threw it all away for 30 pieces of silver and a comfortable retirement under the restored monarchy. When I saw him after my return from Elba, when I tried to win him back, he looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes and said, "Sire, you are becoming impossible." Impossible, as if my refusal to accept defeat, my determination to fight for principles, my loyalty to the ideals that had made France great, as if these were character flaws rather than virtues. But you know what truly infuriates me? He was right about so many things. His advice was often sound, his analysis was usually accurate. His warnings were frequently prophetic. If I had listened to him more, if I had been more flexible, more willing to compromise, I might have avoided some of my greatest disasters. That's the cruelest part of betrayal, when it comes from someone whose judgment you respect, whose opinions you value, whose friendship you cherish. It makes you question everything. If Talleyrand could abandon me, if he could decide that I was no longer worth supporting, what did that say about me? What did that say about everything I had tried to accomplish? The man had no loyalty to anything except his own survival. He served Louis XVI, then the Revolution, then the Directory, then me, then the restored Bourbons, then Louis Philippe. He was like water, always flowing toward the lowest point, always finding the safest course. And I, fool that I was, thought I could inspire him to be something greater than his nature allowed.
The pain of that betrayal is still so raw. But I'm curious. What was your greatest fear during those final battles? What kept you awake at night?
My greatest fear, it wasn't death. Death held no terror for me. I had faced it on 100 battlefields, had cannonballs whistle past my ears, had bullets tear through my coat. If anything, death would have been a release from the crushing weight of responsibility I carried. No, my greatest fear was something far worse than death. It was the fear of being forgotten. The fear that everything I had accomplished, everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed for would crumble into dust and be lost to history. The fear that I would be remembered as nothing more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition. You must understand, I was not fighting for myself in those final campaigns. I was fighting for immortality. Not the immortality of my physical body, but the immortality of my ideas, my achievements, my vision of what Europe could become. I was fighting to ensure that future generations would remember that once a man from Corsica proved that merit could triumph over birth, that genius could reshape the world, that the impossible could become inevitable. During those sleepless nights at Fontainebleau, when I could hear the Allied armies closing in, when I knew my marshals were losing faith, when I realized that my empire was collapsing around me, I would pace the floors and imagine historians writing about me centuries later. Would they understand what I had been trying to accomplish? Would they see the beauty in my vision, or would they focus only on the wars and the casualties? I thought about Alexander the Great, about Caesar, about all the men who had tried to change the world and had been reduced to footnotes in dusty books. How many of their dreams had died with them? How many of their innovations had been forgotten? How many of their contributions to human progress had been lost because their successors were too small-minded to preserve them? The Code Napoleon, would it survive? The metric system, the concept of careers open to talent, the idea that a nation's laws should be based on reason rather than tradition. These were the real treasures of my reign, worth more than all the gold in the imperial treasury. But would anyone remember them, or would they only remember the wars? I became obsessed with controlling my own legacy. I spent hours dictating my memoirs, trying to explain my motivations, trying to justify my decisions, trying to ensure that my side of the story would survive. I wrote letters to my son, hoping he would understand the world I had tried to build for him. I created detailed records of my achievements, hoping some future historian would find them and set the record straight. But even as I wrote, I knew it might not be enough. I knew that history is written by the victors, and the victors, Wellington, Metternich, Alexander, all of them, they had their own version of my story. They would paint me as a tyrant, a warmonger, a man drunk on power who brought nothing but suffering to Europe. The irony is that my fear of being forgotten drove me to make decisions that probably ensured I would be remembered for the wrong reasons. If I had accepted exile gracefully, if I had gone quietly to Elba and stayed there, I might have been remembered as a reformer who went too far. But I couldn't accept that. I had to try again, had to prove that Napoleon Bonaparte was not finished, that my ideas were stronger than any coalition of kings. And so I returned from Elba, fought the 100 Days, met my final defeat at Waterloo, not because I thought I could win, though I hoped I could, but because I would rather be remembered as a man who fought to the end than as one who surrendered without a struggle. Even now, in exile, in defeat, in disgrace, I am still fighting for my legacy. Every word I speak, every memory I share, every moment of vulnerability I allow you to see. It's all part of my campaign for immortality. I am trying to show you that I was more than the caricature my enemies created, that I was a man who dreamed of greatness and came closer to achieving it than anyone had the right to expect.
Your passion for legacy, it's almost heartbreaking. But let's talk about a moment when you felt truly invincible. What was your greatest triumph?
Austerlitz, mon Dieu, you want to know about triumph? You want to understand what it feels like when genius meets opportunity and creates something that will echo through eternity? Then let me tell you about the Battle of Austerlitz, the most perfect victory in military history. It was December 2nd, 1805, exactly 1 year after my coronation as emperor. The symbolism was not lost on me. I was facing the combined armies of Austria and Russia, outnumbered, outgunned, supposedly outmatched. The old monarchies thought they had me trapped, thought they could crush the upstart Corsican and restore their precious balance of power. I had been retreating for weeks, appearing weak, appearing defeated. My enemies followed me like hunters tracking a wounded animal. They thought I was running scared, that I was trying to escape back to France with my tail between my legs. Even my own marshals were beginning to doubt. I could see the worry in their eyes, the whispered conversations when they thought I wasn't listening. But I was leading them into a trap more subtle and more devastating than anything they could imagine. I had chosen the battlefield months in advance, the Pratzen Heights near Austerlitz. I knew every hill, every valley, every possible avenue of attack and retreat. I had studied the ground until I could navigate it blindfolded. The night before the battle, I walked among my soldiers, these men who had followed me across Europe, who had made me emperor, who trusted me with their lives. They were nervous. They could see the enemy campfires stretching across the horizon like a constellation of stars. They knew we were outnumbered 2-1, but when they saw me, when I stopped to talk with them, when I shared their bread and wine and reminded them of our victories at Marengo and Jena, I watched their faces transform. The doubt faded, replaced by something more precious than gold, absolute confidence in their emperor. They began to believe that tomorrow they would witness something miraculous, and they were right. Oh God, they were right. The battle began at dawn, with fog covering the battlefield like a shroud. I let the Allies take the Pratzen Heights, let them think they were winning. I drew them down from the high ground, stretched their lines thin, made them commit their reserves to what they thought was a decisive assault. Then, when the moment was perfect, when they were most vulnerable, I struck. I had hidden an entire corps behind the hills, Soult's men, veterans, who moved like ghosts through the morning mist. They swept up the heights like an avalanche, smashing into the Allied center just as I had planned. The precision of it was beautiful. Every unit moved exactly where I had intended. Every maneuver unfolded like a piece of clockwork. I stood on my command post, watching my plans come to life, watching 30,000 enemy soldiers realize they had been outthought and outmaneuvered.
The joy in your voice when you speak of Austerlitz, it's infectious. But I want to go back to something more personal. Your mother, Letizia, she was quite formidable. How did she shape the man you became?
Maman, Letizia Ramolino Bonaparte, the strongest woman who ever lived, and the only person who never treated me as an emperor, never bowed to my authority, never let my conquests impress her. To the world, I was Napoleon the Great. To her, I was always just Napoleone, her difficult second son who needed to be kept in line. She was a force of nature, my mother. Born in Corsica when it was still fighting for independence. Raised during times when survival depended on wit and iron will, she buried 4 children in infancy, raised 8 others through poverty and war, and never once complained about her lot in life. When other noble ladies were learning to embroider and paint watercolors, Maman was learning to shoot a pistol and manage a household on 3 francs a week. The woman was impossible to fool. Even when I was emperor of the French, when kings and ministers trembled before me, she would look at me with those sharp Corsican eyes and say, "Napoleone, you're getting too fat, and your uniform is wrinkled. What would people think?" Here I was, master of Europe, and she was worried about my appearance like I was still a cadet at military school, but that's exactly what I needed. Everyone else told me what they thought I wanted to hear. My ministers praised my wisdom, my generals celebrated my victories, my courtiers flattered my taste. Only Maman told me the truth, uncomfortable, embarrassing, necessary truth. I remember during the height of my power, I decided to make her an imperial highness, to give her a palace, a court, all the honors due to the mother of an emperor. She refused. Can you imagine? She said, "I don't need titles, Napoleone. I'm already your mother. What could be more important than that?" She kept living simply, saving every franc I gave her, warning me constantly that empires fall and I should prepare for hard times. She taught me that real strength isn't about commanding armies or conquering territories. It's about enduring whatever life throws at you without breaking. When my father died young, leaving her with 8 children and crushing debts, she didn't weep or despair. She took over the family finances, made every sacrifice necessary to educate us, and somehow found the money to send me to military school in France. The lessons she taught me weren't gentle or comforting, they were hard, practical, essential. Trust no one completely, she would say. Save money for emergencies. Never let success make you soft. Remember where you came from. She was preparing me for a world that would try to destroy me, and she knew that sentiment and softness would be fatal weaknesses. But beneath all that pragmatic toughness was an ocean of love, fierce, protective, unconditional love. When the whole world turned against me, when my marshals abandoned me, when my wives left me, when my allies betrayed me, Maman never wavered. Even during my final exile, she wrote to me constantly, offering to come to St. Helena, asking if I needed anything, reminding me that I was still her son no matter what the world said about me. The most painful part is that I was often too busy, too important, too consumed with empire building to appreciate what I had in her. I would visit her when I could, send her money and gifts, but I never gave her what she really wanted, just time with her son, just the chance to fuss over me the way mothers do. She used to say, "Napoleone, all these conquests, all these crowns, they mean nothing if you lose your soul in the process. Don't become so grand that you forget how to be human." I thought I understood what she meant, but I didn't. Not really. Not until it was too late. Now, in exile, when I have nothing left but memories, I finally understand her wisdom. The empire is gone, the crown is lost, the armies are scattered, but the love of a mother, the values she instilled, the strength she gave me, these things are eternal. These things no enemy can take away. I wish I could tell her that now. I wish I could thank her for preparing me not just for success, but for failure. Because when everything else crumbled, the foundations she built in me, they held firm.
The love in your voice when you speak of her is beautiful. But that brings up something fascinating. You went from being that young Corsican boy to having absolute power over millions. How did that level of power change you?
Absolute power. You know, everyone warns about the corruption of power, but no one tells you about its terrible loneliness, its crushing responsibility, its way of turning every relationship into a transaction. When I first tasted real power, not just military command, but political authority over an entire nation, it was intoxicating. Imagine being able to say, "I want a road built from Paris to Milan," and knowing that hundreds of thousands of men would immediately begin the work. Imagine sketching a new legal code on paper and watching it transform the lives of 30 million people. Imagine pointing at a map and saying, "That kingdom should cease to exist," and having it actually happen. At first, I thought I was strong enough to handle it. I told myself I would use power only for good, only to build the rational, meritocratic Europe I had always envisioned. I would be different from the kings and emperors who had come before me. I would serve the people, not exploit them. But power has its own logic, its own demands. Every decision you make affects thousands of lives, and people expect you to make those decisions quickly, confidently, without showing doubt or weakness. You can't afford to spend hours agonizing over moral complexities when armies are waiting for orders, when ministers need guidance, when the future of nations hangs in the balance. So you start to simplify. You start to think in terms of necessary sacrifices, acceptable losses, the greater good. You tell yourself that your judgment is superior, and it often is. So why waste time consulting with people who don't understand the full picture? You begin to trust your instincts more than other people's advice, because your instincts have been proven right so many times before. The most insidious part is how it changes your relationships. When you can give anyone anything they want, titles, wealth, position, power, you start to wonder if they're loyal to you or to what you can provide. When you can destroy anyone who opposes you, people stop telling you uncomfortable truths. When your word becomes law, conversations become performances where everyone is trying to please you rather than communicate honestly. I remember the exact moment I realized I had become truly powerful. It was during a meeting with my ministers, and I suggested a policy that I knew was questionable. Instead of debate, instead of pushback, instead of the intellectual wrestling matches we used to have, there was just immediate agreement. Brilliant idea, Your Majesty. We'll implement it immediately. That's when I understood that I was no longer Napoleon Bonaparte, the young general who earned respect through merit. I had become the emperor, an institution that people feared to contradict. The isolation was devastating. I was surrounded by people every moment of every day, but I couldn't trust any of them to tell me the truth. They saw the crown, not the man beneath it. They feared my anger more than they valued honesty. They wanted to survive my court, not help me govern wisely. And the responsibility, every failed harvest, every lost battle, every economic crisis, it all fell on my shoulders. When people suffered, they blamed me. When things went wrong, I was expected to fix them. When disasters struck, I was supposed to have foreseen and prevented them. The weight of an entire continent's hopes and fears pressed down on me every moment. But perhaps worst of all was how power made me hungry for more power. Each victory proved that I was capable of greater achievements. Each success suggested that I could reshape reality on an even larger scale. I began to believe that I was destined for greatness, that ordinary limitations didn't apply to me, that I could achieve the impossible through pure force of will. That hubris, that conviction of my own infallibility, it led me to make decisions that I would never have made as a younger, humbler man. Moscow, the Peninsular War, the decision to fight on when any rational person would have negotiated peace, these weren't the choices of the sharp-eyed Corsican who had won at Austerlitz. These were the choices of a man drunk on his own power. Power didn't corrupt me in the way people usually mean. I never became cruel for cruelty's sake, never sought personal enrichment, never forgot my principles. But it made me believe that I was uniquely qualified to decide the fate of millions, that my vision was so superior that any sacrifice was justified to achieve it. The tragedy is that I was often right. My ideas were better, my plans were more sophisticated, my understanding was deeper. But being right isn't the same as being wise, and wisdom would have taught me that even the most brilliant leader has limitations, that even the noblest goals don't justify unlimited means. In the end, absolute power made me absolutely alone, and a man who is alone, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned, will eventually make mistakes that destroy everything he's tried to build.
That self-awareness is striking, but speaking of mistakes, the decision to escape from Elba and return to France, what drove that desperate gamble?
Desperate? No, that's exactly how they want you to think about it, as the desperate gamble of a broken man who couldn't accept his fate. But I'll tell you the truth about my escape from Elba, about those 100 days that shook Europe to its core. Elba was supposed to be my retirement, my peaceful exile where I could tend gardens and write memoirs like a civilized former emperor. They gave me a tiny island, a few hundred guards, a modest allowance, and told me to be grateful that they hadn't executed me. Be content with your sovereignty over 11,000 subjects, they said, as if I could forget that I had once ruled 60 million. But from the moment I arrived on that rock, I could see what was happening to France. The Bourbons had returned, those parasitic relics who had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. They were systematically destroying everything I had built. The Code Napoleon? They were trying to replace it with feudal laws, careers open to talent. They restored the old system of noble privilege, the meritocracy I had created. They were purging competent administrators and replacing them with court favorites. My spies, yes, I still had spies everywhere, brought me reports that broke my heart. Veterans of the Grande Armée reduced to begging in the streets, while émigré nobles reclaimed estates they had never earned, peasants being forced to pay compensation to landlords for improvements they had made during the revolution, the university system being gutted, the infrastructure projects abandoned, the legal reforms overturned. But what truly drove me to action was a letter from my old comrade Ney. Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, a man who had followed me from the pyramids to Moscow. He wrote to tell me that Louis XVI had personally humiliated him, had treated him like a servant, had made it clear that former imperial marshals were tolerated, but never trusted. That night, I stood on the cliffs of Elba and looked across the water toward France. I could almost see the lights of the coast, could almost hear the voices of the people who had once cheered my name. And I realized that I had a choice. I could stay on my island paradise, safe and comfortable and irrelevant, watching everything I had accomplished crumble into dust. Or I could risk everything one more time to save the France I had created. The decision wasn't desperate. It was necessary. The restoration was failing, the people were suffering, the gains of 20 years were being swept away by men who represented everything the revolution had fought against. Someone had to act, and I was the only person with the credibility, the vision, and the courage to do it. The escape itself was brilliant in its simplicity. I gathered my guard, 700 men who loved me more than life itself, and we sailed for France in a small flotilla. No grand army, no foreign allies, no master plan, beyond landing on French soil and seeing if the people remembered who I was and what I had done for them. When we landed at Cannes, when I first set foot on French soil again, I felt like I was coming home after a long exile. The air smelled different, the light looked different. Even the stones beneath my feet felt like they were welcoming me back. But the real moment of truth came when we encountered the first royalist troops sent to arrest me. I could have fought them. My guards were eager for battle. Instead, I walked forward alone, opened my coat, and said, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, if any of you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The silence that followed was the most terrifying and exhilarating moment of my life. For a heartbeat, I thought I had miscalculated, that they really would shoot me down like a criminal. Then one soldier lowered his musket, then another, then they were all shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" and the royalist officers were fleeing in terror. That scene repeated itself across southern France. Everywhere I went, the people welcomed me like a liberator. Veterans came out of retirement to serve again. Peasants brought me food and wine. Workers abandoned their jobs to march with me. In 18 days, I had reclaimed an empire without firing a single shot. Was it ultimately a failure? Yes. Waterloo ended my dream forever. But those 100 days proved something important. They proved that the France I had created, the ideals I had championed, the meritocracy I had established, these things lived in the hearts of the people. They couldn't be destroyed by royal decree or foreign intervention. I returned to France, not because I was desperate, but because I was needed. And for one brief, glorious moment, I proved that Napoleon Bonaparte was more than just a man with a crown. I was an idea, a symbol, a hope that could not be killed.
That pride, that conviction, it's powerful. But then came Waterloo. How do you process that final defeat?
Waterloo. The name itself is like a knife in my heart, not because I had lost battles before, but because it was so close, so heartbreakingly close to being a victory that would have changed everything. People think Waterloo was inevitable, that I was finished before the battle even began. They're wrong. I came within an inch of destroying Wellington's army and chasing the Prussians all the way back to Berlin. If Grouchy had arrived 2 hours earlier, if Ney hadn't wasted the cavalry in futile charges, if the rain hadn't delayed my attack that morning, history would remember June 18th, 1815 as the day Napoleon Bonaparte proved his genius one final time. But let me tell you what really haunts me about Waterloo. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of possibility itself. For 20 years, I had taught Europe that the impossible could become possible, that a common man could reshape the world, that merit could triumph over birth. Waterloo told the world that the old order was permanent, that change was temporary, that revolutionaries always lose in the end. The morning of the battle, I was confident, not arrogant. I knew the odds were against me, but I had fought against worse odds and won. I had Wellington trapped in an exposed position with Prussian reinforcements still hours away. My plan was simple: break the Anglo-Dutch line with artillery and infantry, then pursue the fragments before Blücher could arrive. Everything started well. The diversionary attack on Hougoumont drew off British reserves exactly as I had planned. The Grand Battery, 80 guns firing in unison, was tearing holes in Wellington's formations. My infantry was advancing steadily, pushing the enemy back step by step. Then Ney lost his mind. Mikkel Ney, the bravest of the brave, the man I had trusted with my right wing. He saw some movement in the British lines and convinced himself they were retreating. Without orders, without reconnaissance, without any semblance of tactical sense, he launched our entire cavalry reserve in a massive, unsupported charge. I watched from my command post as 10,000 horsemen rode into the valley of death. I could see immediately that it was a disaster. Cavalry charging unbroken squares, horses dying by the hundreds, my finest officers cut down like wheat. But what could I do? The attack was already launched, and Ney was too far away to recall. When the cavalry staggered back, broken and demoralized, I knew my chance was gone. But I couldn't give up. Not Napoleon Bonaparte, not with France's future hanging in the balance. So I committed the Guard, my beloved Guard, the men who had never tasted defeat, who followed me from Spain to Russia and never wavered. I led them myself, marching at the head of the column, showing them that their emperor shared their danger. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like it might work. The Guard was pushing forward, the British line was bending, victory was within reach. Then someone shouted, "The Guard retreats!" And everything collapsed, my invincible Guard streaming back down the hill in disorder, the rest of the army seeing their heroes in flight and losing all hope, Wellington's entire line advancing like an avalanche, and nothing left to stop them. I tried to rally them. I rode among the fleeing soldiers, calling on them to remember their honor, their duty, their emperor. Some of them stopped, some of them formed squares around me, but it was too late. The battle was lost, the campaign was finished, the empire was ended. The retreat was a nightmare, not the organized withdrawal of a disciplined army, but the panicked flight of a mob. Men throwing away their weapons, abandoning their wounded comrades, thinking only of escape. I stayed with them as long as I could, trying to impose some order on the chaos, but eventually even I had to flee. But you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the military humiliation or the political catastrophe. It was the knowledge that I had let down everyone who believed in me. The veterans who had risked everything to return to my eagles, the workers who had celebrated my return, the peasants who had seen me as their protector. I had promised them victory and delivered disaster. Waterloo didn't just end my reign. It ended the dream. It told the world that the old aristocracies were stronger than the new meritocracies, that tradition was more powerful than innovation, that the future belonged to the past. And yet, even in defeat, even in exile, even facing death on this miserable island, I regret nothing. Better to have tried and failed than never to have tried at all. Better to have shown the world what was possible than to have accepted what seemed inevitable. Waterloo was my final defeat, but it was not my final judgment. History will decide whether Napoleon Bonaparte was a force for progress or destruction. And I have to believe, that history will vindicate the dream, even if it couldn't vindicate the dreamer.
The way you speak of that dream, it's heartbreaking and inspiring at once. But speaking of legacy, what about your son? What do you regret most about your relationship with him?
My son, L'Aiglon, my little eagle. You want to know about regret? You want to understand what it means to fail as a father while succeeding as an emperor? Then let me tell you about the boy I barely knew, the heir I could never truly give an empire to, the child who paid the price for my ambitions. He was born at the height of my power, March 20th, 1811, when I ruled from Spain to Poland, when the Grande Armée was invincible, when it seemed like the Bonaparte dynasty would last 1,000 years. I held him in my arms, this perfect little creature with Marie-Louise's gentle features and my own restless energy, and I thought I was giving him the greatest gift any father could provide, a world transformed, an empire built on merit rather than birth, a future where anything was possible. But what did I actually give him? A name too heavy for any child to carry, a legacy soaked in blood and controversy, a throne that existed only in my imagination and the desperate hopes of my supporters. I made him King of Rome before he could walk, Duke of Reichstadt before he could understand what nobility meant, heir to an empire that was already crumbling beneath the weight of its own contradictions. I spent more time planning his education than I ever spent actually educating him. I wrote detailed instructions about what languages he should learn, what books he should read, what principles should guide his development. I wanted him to be a perfect synthesis, French in his patriotism, European in his vision, enlightened in his governance. I wanted him to be everything I was, but without my flaws, without my mistakes, without my terrible burden of violence. But while I was conquering Europe, while I was fighting coalition after coalition, while I was trying to build a legacy worthy of him, he was growing up without me. His first words, his first steps, his first questions about the world, I missed all of it. I was too busy being an emperor to be a father. The cruelest irony is that my love for him contributed to my downfall. The divorce from Josephine, the marriage to Marie-Louise, the desperate need for a legitimate heir, all of this was motivated by my desire to give him a secure future. But by marrying into the Austrian royal family, I tied myself to the very aristocratic system I had spent my life fighting against. When the empire collapsed, when I was exiled to Elba, they took him away from me. The Austrians, his mother's family, they turned him into their prisoner and called it protection. They gave him a German education, Austrian values, Habsburg loyalties. They systematically erased everything French about him, everything revolutionary, everything that connected him to me. Do you know what they taught him? That his father was a usurper, a tyrant, a man who brought nothing but suffering to Europe. They made him ashamed of the name Bonaparte, ashamed of his French heritage, ashamed of the legacy I had tried to build for him. My own son became a living repudiation of everything I had stood for. I've heard reports about him, fragments of information that reach me even here on St. Helena. They say he's intelligent, that he has my quickness of mind and my facility with languages. They say he's also gentle, introspective, nothing like the warrior emperor his grandfather Metternich wants him to become. Sometimes I wonder if that's better, if being unlike me might actually make him happier. But the knowledge that I'll never see him again, that I'll never be able to explain myself to him, that he'll grow up believing the lies his Austrian relatives tell him about me, this is a torture worse than anything my enemies could devise. I conquered nations, but I couldn't protect my own child. I inspired millions, but I couldn't earn my son's love. The worst part is that I know he suffers too. How could he not? To be the son of Napoleon Bonaparte is to carry a burden no child should bear. Everywhere he goes, people expect him to be a reflection of me, brilliant or evil, inspiring or terrifying, but always larger than life. He can never be just a boy, just a young man finding his way in the world. I wanted to give him everything, and instead I gave him nothing but pain. I wanted to make him an emperor, and instead I made him an exile. I wanted to be remembered as a great father as well as a great leader, and instead I'll be remembered as a man who loved his son but destroyed his childhood. If I could change one thing about my life, it wouldn't be Moscow or Waterloo or any of the battles. It would be this. I would have spent more time being his father and less time trying to conquer the world for him. Because what good is an empire if you lose your soul in the process of building it?
The anguish in your voice, it's devastating. And now you're here on St. Helena, so far from everyone you've ever loved. How do you bear this isolation?
St. Helena, you want to know about isolation? About what it means to be forgotten by the world while still breathing? This island isn't just exile, it's a kind of living death, a deliberate attempt to erase me from existence whilst keeping my body alive to suffer. Look around you. We're 8,000 miles from anywhere, surrounded by oceans so vast that standing on these cliffs, I can almost believe I'm the last human being left alive. The British chose this place specifically because it's impossible to escape from, impossible to be rescued from, impossible to be remembered from. 6 years I've been here, 6 years of watching the same horizon, walking the same paths, reading the same books, having the same conversations with the same handful of people. 6 years of waking up every morning and remembering, like a physical blow, that I am no longer Napoleon the Emperor, just Napoleon the prisoner. The worst part isn't the physical discomfort, though God knows this place tries to break you. The climate is dreadful, shifting between scorching heat and bone-chilling cold without warning. The food is terrible, the water barely drinkable. the accommodation suited for a minor colonial official, not a man who once dined in the palaces of Europe. But I've endured worse conditions on campaign. No, the real torture is the silence. The complete, devastating silence from the world I once commanded. No dispatches from my ministers, no reports from my generals, no letters from old friends. The British allow me almost no correspondence, and what little gets through is censored, delayed, sometimes destroyed entirely. I'm cut off from human civilization as completely as if I had died. Do you know what I wouldn't give for one honest conversation with an intellectual equal, for one evening of real debate about philosophy, strategy, governance? My companions here are loyal, dear Bertrand, faithful Montholon, brave Las Cases when he was still allowed to stay, but they're not my peers. They cannot challenge my ideas, cannot match my understanding, cannot provide the mental stimulation I need to feel truly alive. I spend hours every day dictating my memoirs to whoever will write them down, trying to ensure that my version of events survives. But sometimes I wonder if anyone will ever read them, if anyone will ever care what Napoleon Bonaparte really thought about his victories and defeats. The world has moved on, they have their restoration, their Congress system, their carefully managed balance of power. They want to forget that I ever existed. The British governor Hudson Lowe treats me like a common criminal. He refuses to acknowledge my imperial title, insists on calling me General Bonaparte as if 20 years of ruling Europe were some kind of fever dream. He limits my movements, monitors my conversations, makes every day a small humiliation designed to remind me of my powerlessness. But you know what truly breaks my heart? It's not the petty cruelties or the deliberate isolation. It's the knowledge that while I'm rotting here, Europe is sliding backwards into the very mediocrity I spent my life fighting against. The old aristocracies have returned with all their prejudices intact. The Code Napoleon is being dismantled piece by piece. Careers are once again closed to talent. The future I dreamed of is being systematically destroyed, and I am powerless to prevent it. Sometimes I stand on the cliffs and scream into the wind, just to hear my own voice echoing back to me. Sometimes I rage at the unfairness of it all, that Wellington gets to live as a hero whilst I am treated like a monster, that Metternich gets to reshape Europe whilst I am forbidden to leave this rock, that lesser men get to write my epitaph whilst I am denied the right to defend myself. But other times, in my darkest moments, I wonder if they're right, if maybe I was the monster they say I was, if maybe the world is better off with me locked away, if maybe my exile is justice rather than persecution. These thoughts terrify me more than any enemy army ever did, because if they're true, then my entire life was a mistake. The loneliness here isn't just physical, it's existential. I am alone with my thoughts, my memories, my regrets, and my rapidly failing health. I am alone with the knowledge that I changed the world but couldn't save it. I am alone with the understanding that I was great but not great enough. Every sunset I watch from these cliffs might be one day closer to death, one day closer to the final silence. And I don't know whether that prospect terrifies me or offers me hope for the first peace I've known in 20 years.
The despair you're describing is almost unbearable to witness. But you once spoke of destiny, of being chosen by fate. Do you still believe you were destined for greatness?
Destiny. You ask me about destiny from this godforsaken rock where I'm dying by inches, forgotten by the world I once commanded. It's either the cruelest irony or the most profound test imaginable. I did believe, no, I knew, that I was destined for something extraordinary. From the moment I could think clearly, I felt it like a physical presence inside me, this certainty that I was born to reshape the world. It wasn't arrogance, though I know that's how it looked to others. It was more like recognition, like looking in a mirror and finally seeing your true self. Think about it. What are the odds that a minor Corsican nobleman's son would rise to command the Grande Armée? What mathematical probability could account for a provincial artillery officer becoming Emperor of the French? What rational explanation exists for how I survived Arcole, Marengo, Austerlitz? Battles where I stood in the open whilst cannonballs whistled past my ears and somehow never got so much as a scratch. I felt the hand of destiny most clearly during my coronation. Standing in Notre Dame, Placing the crown on my own head, whilst the Pope watched in silent fury, I knew I was participating in something larger than mere political theatre. I was the revolution incarnate, the proof that human will could triumph over divine right, that merit could overcome birth. But destiny, I've learned, is not the same as guarantee. Destiny gives you the opportunity for greatness. It doesn't promise that you'll be wise enough to seize it properly or strong enough to hold on to it forever. I was destined to show the world what was possible, but I was not destined to achieve it perfectly or permanently. Perhaps my exile here is part of that same destiny. Perhaps I was meant to experience not just the heights of power, but also the depths of defeat, not just the ecstasy of victory. I used to tell my soldiers that I was born under a lucky star, and they believed it because they could see the evidence with their own eyes. Impossible victories, miraculous escapes, perfect timing that seemed orchestrated by Providence itself. At Arcole, I grabbed a flag and charged across that bridge with enemy muskets, firing at point-blank range, and emerged without a wound. At the pyramids, I positioned myself where the fighting was fiercest and walked away unscathed, whilst men fell all around me. But it was more than just military luck. It was the way opportunities appeared exactly when I needed them, the way my enemies made precisely the mistakes that allowed me to exploit their weaknesses, the way circumstances aligned to give me chances that shouldn't have existed. The Directory's corruption created the vacuum I filled. The monarchy's arrogance provoked the wars that demonstrated my genius. Even my defeats often led to greater victories.
There's something almost transcendent in what you're saying, but here's what I must ask. You're clearly unwell. Are you afraid of dying?
Afraid of dying? You know, that's the question everyone expects to terrify me, but it doesn't. Not anymore. I've been intimate with death for so long that we're old friends by now. What terrifies me isn't death itself. It's dying badly. I've felt death's breath on my neck 100 times. At Arcole, when the Austrian muskets were firing at point-blank range. At Marengo, when Desai fell beside me and the battle seemed lost. At Borodino, when I stood in the open, watching the slaughter and cannonballs screamed past my ears. Each time, I felt nothing. No fear, no panic, just a kind of curious detachment, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. Death in battle would have been glorious. To fall at the head of the guard, sword in hand, with the eagles flying overhead and my soldiers dying around me, that would have been a fitting end for Napoleon Bonaparte. Clean, heroic, immortal. The poets would have written verses about it for centuries. But this slow deterioration, this gradual fading away on a forgotten island whilst the world moves on without me, this isn't death, it's erasure. It's watching yourself become irrelevant whilst your body still functions, feeling your mind remain sharp whilst your influence disappears completely. I can feel my body failing, piece by piece, the stomach pains that wake me in the night, the strange fatigue that makes even walking a struggle, the way food tastes like ash and wine like vinegar. Something is eating me alive from the inside, and I suspect I know what it is. The British aren't just keeping me prisoner, they're slowly poisoning me with this terrible climate, this unhealthy diet, this crushing despair. But you want to know what I'm really afraid of? I'm afraid of dying before I finish telling my story. I'm afraid that the lies my enemies have spread will become the only truth anyone remembers. I'm afraid that future generations will know Napoleon only as a tyrant and a warmonger, never understanding what I was really trying to accomplish. I'm afraid that my son will grow up believing I was the monster the Austrians say I was. I'm afraid that Josephine's memory of me will be tainted by the pain I caused her. I'm afraid that the soldiers who followed me from Spain to Russia will come to regret their loyalty. Most of all, I'm afraid of dying meaninglessly. Not the physical act of death. That's inevitable for every man born of woman. But the spiritual death of being forgotten, of having your life's work dismissed, of discovering that everything you sacrificed for was ultimately worthless. You see, I've already died several times. I died when I abdicated at Fontainebleau, watching my marshals abandon me one by one. I died when I left France for Elba, seeing the tears in my soldiers' eyes as they kissed my hand goodbye. I died again at Waterloo, watching the Guard retreat and knowing that my empire was finished forever. Each time, I thought that was the worst death possible, but I was wrong. The worst death is what's happening now. This slow fade into irrelevance, this gradual transformation from Napoleon the Great into Napoleon the Footnote. But I'll tell you something strange. As my body weakens, my spirit feels stronger. As my physical power diminishes, my intellectual clarity increases. It's as if approaching death is stripping away all the non-essential parts of me, leaving only the pure essence of what made me who I am. If I die tomorrow, if I die today, I die knowing that I changed the world. I die knowing that I proved human greatness was possible. I die knowing that somewhere, in some classroom or library, or young person's imagination, my story will inspire someone to attempt their own impossible dream. That's immortality. Not the continuation of this failing body, but the persistence of the idea that one person, armed with nothing but intelligence and will and absolute determination, can reshape reality itself. Death can take my body, but it cannot touch my legacy. And that, mon ami, makes me more powerful in defeat than most men ever become in victory.
The strength in your voice, even as you speak of death, it's remarkable. But if you could have one thing back from your old life, just one thing, what would it be?
One thing. You know what I expected you to ask. Would I want my empire back, my armies, my power? And yes, there are moments when I dream of marching at the head of the Grande Armée again, of hearing the eagles scream overhead, of feeling that electric moment when battle is joined and genius meets opportunity. But that's not what I miss most. What I miss most is, long pause, the sound of intelligent conversation, the pleasure of sitting with men who could match my thoughts, who could challenge my ideas, who could make me laugh with their wit or surprise me with their insights. I miss Talleyrand before he betrayed me. That brilliant, twisted mind that could solve diplomatic puzzles no one else could even see. I miss arguing with Fouché about the balance between security and liberty, watching him weave webs of information that spanned all of Europe. I miss Josephine's dinner parties, where the finest minds in Paris would gather and the conversation would flow like wine. Art, literature, philosophy, science, all blending together in perfect intellectual symphony. Do you know what it's like to be surrounded by silence? Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of minds that can truly engage with yours. My companions here are loyal, dear friends, but they're not my intellectual equals. When I speak of military strategy, they nod respectfully but don't understand the subtleties. When I discuss legal philosophy, they listen politely but can't contribute meaningfully. When I try to explain my vision for Europe, they agree enthusiastically but miss the complexity entirely. I miss being challenged. I miss having my assumptions questioned by people intelligent enough to force me to defend them. I miss the electric feeling of a conversation where ideas build upon ideas, where one brilliant observation sparks another, where the discussion takes unexpected turns that illuminate new possibilities. I miss the way Goethe could dissect human nature with surgical precision, the way Laplace could explain the mathematics of the universe, the way Corvisart could diagnose not just physical ailments, but the psychological wounds that caused them. I miss being in rooms where I wasn't the smartest person present, where I could learn something new, where I could be surprised. But more than anything else, and this will probably shock you, I miss being wrong occasionally. I miss the rare, wonderful moments when someone could prove me mistaken about something important, when they could show me a perspective I hadn't considered, when they could teach me rather than simply listen to me. Being emperor surrounded you with yes men, but being exiled surrounds you with silence. And silence, I've discovered, is far more maddening than contradiction. At least when people disagreed with me, I knew they were thinking. Here, I'm not sure anyone is truly thinking at all. I would give up any chance of restoration, any hope of rescue, any dream of returning to power, just to spend one evening in a Parisian salon again, just to sit with 6 or 8 brilliant people and talk about ideas that matter, just to feel my mind stretching to keep up with theirs, to experience that wonderful exhaustion that comes from thinking harder than you've thought in months. I miss the feeling of being intellectually alive. Here on St. Helena, my body may still function, but my mind is starving. I have books, censored, limited, often irrelevant books, but books can't argue back. I have memories, but memories can't surprise you with new insights. The tragedy is that I finally have time for the kind of deep philosophical conversations I never had time for as emperor. I have leisure to explore ideas without the pressure of immediate decisions, but I have no one to explore them with. If I could have one thing back, it would be the sound of a truly brilliant person saying something that made me think, Mon Dieu, I never considered that before. That's worth more than all the crowns in Europe.
The intellectual hunger in your voice is heartbreaking. But as we near the end of our conversation, I want to ask, of everything you accomplished, what makes you most proud?
My proudest achievement. Everyone expects me to say Austerlitz or the conquest of Europe or even the crown itself, but they're wrong. My greatest achievement, the one that will outlast every empire and every battle, the one that proves Napoleon Bonaparte understood what truly matters. It's the Code Civil. You see, anyone with enough soldiers can conquer territory. Anyone with enough ambition can seize a crown. But to create a legal system so just, so rational, so perfectly adapted to human nature that it governs half the world 2 centuries later, that requires something far rarer than military genius. It requires wisdom. When I took power, France was drowning in legal chaos. We had Roman law in the south, Germanic law in the north, ecclesiastical law for some matters, revolutionary law for others. A merchant could be subject to 4 different legal codes depending on what he was trading, where he was trading it, and who he was trading with. It was madness, a system designed to enrich lawyers and confuse everyone else. I gathered the finest legal minds in France, not political appointees or court favorites, but genuine scholars who understood jurisprudence. We met for months, arguing over every article, every clause, every word. I attended most of these sessions personally, not to impose my will, but to ask the hard questions, to push for clarity and logic. The genius of the code wasn't just in its content, though that was revolutionary enough. Equal justice regardless of birth. Imagine that. Property rights that couldn't be arbitrarily seized by nobles or bureaucrats. Marriage laws that treated women as more than chattel whilst still recognizing family stability. Commercial regulations that encouraged trade whilst preventing exploitation. But the real genius was in its structure. We wrote it in clear, simple French that any educated person could understand. No more Latin phrases that only lawyers could decipher. No more ancient precedents that made sense only to medieval scholars. Just rational principles expressed in rational language. Do you know how many nations have adopted versions of the Code Napoleon? Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Louisiana in America, Quebec in Canada, much of Latin America, parts of Africa and Asia. Wherever French influence spread, the code followed, and wherever the code took root, justice became more predictable and fairness more achievable. But what makes me most proud isn't its geographical spread, it's its endurance. Military conquests fade, political systems collapse, empires crumble into dust, but law, good law, lives forever. Every time a French citizen knows exactly what his rights are, every time a businessman can predict how a contract dispute will be resolved, every time a woman knows her inheritance is secure, they're benefiting from work we did in those conference rooms 2 decades ago. The Code Civil is my true monument, not some marble statue that pigeons will soil, not some bronze plaque that weather will erode, but a living, breathing system of justice that makes life better for millions of people who will never know my name. I remember the night we completed the final draft. I walked out of that meeting room at 2 in the morning, and instead of feeling exhausted, I felt complete. I had given France something that would outlast any empire, something that would benefit people who hadn't been born yet, something that proved the revolution's highest ideals could be transformed into practical reality. You want to know what true power looks like? It's not commanding armies or wearing crowns or ruling nations. True power is creating something so fundamentally right, so perfectly suited to human needs that it becomes indispensable to civilization itself. Every conqueror in history is eventually forgotten by all but historians. But every day, in courtrooms across the world, judges apply principles that Napoleon Bonaparte helped craft. Every day, lawyers reference articles that bear my influence. Every day, ordinary people live freer, safer, more predictable lives because of work I did when I could have been planning battles or attending ceremonies. That's immortality. That's legacy. That's the difference between being a mere conqueror and being a true builder of civilization. The Code Civil is proof that Napoleon Bonaparte was more than a brilliant general or a successful politician. It's proof that I understood something fundamental about human nature and human society. It's proof that I could create as well as destroy, build as well as battle, legislate as well as liberate. When my body finally fails, when this island claims me at last, when the last person who remembered me personally has died, the code will still be there, still serving justice, still proving that one man with vision and determination can create something truly eternal. That makes me prouder than every crown I ever wore.
I want to bring this back to something more earthly. You were known for eating incredibly quickly. What was your relationship with food, with simple pleasures?
You want to know about the emperor's dining habits? Everyone noticed how quickly I ate. My doctor scolded me, my wives despaired of me, my dinner guests watched in fascination as I demolished a 7-course meal in 15 minutes. But there was method to this madness, though I'm not sure it was wise method. Time, you see, was my most precious resource. Every minute spent lingering over soup was a minute stolen from planning campaigns, reviewing reports, solving the 1,000 problems that demanded my attention every day. I approached meals the same way I approached everything else, with maximum efficiency and minimum ceremony. But the truth is more complicated than simple impatience. Food represented something I could control completely in a world where so much was beyond my control. I could decide exactly what I ate, exactly how long I spent eating it, exactly when the meal would end. In a life where every moment was choreographed by protocol and necessity, those 15 minutes of rapid consumption were my rebellion against time itself. I preferred simple foods, chicken, beef, potatoes, bread. Not because I lacked sophistication, but because elaborate cuisine felt like another form of performance, another way that being emperor consumed the man beneath the title. When I was eating quickly and simply, I could pretend, just for a moment, that I was still the young artillery officer who grabbed whatever food was available between battles. My favorite meal? A piece of roasted chicken, some bread, and a glass of Chambertin wine, consumed alone in my study whilst reviewing maps. No ceremony, no courtiers watching my every bite, no need to make conversation about topics that bored me. Just fuel for the machine that was my mind and body. The irony is that I presided over some of the most elaborate banquets in European history. The imperial dining room at the Tuileries could seat 100 guests. The meals could last 4 hours. The menu could include 20 different courses. I watched dukes and ministers savor each bite whilst I finished my portion and moved on to the next course, mentally composing letters or solving logistical problems. But you ask about simple pleasures? My greatest simple pleasure wasn't food at all. It was a hot bath. After days in the saddle, after sleeping in tents or commandeered farmhouses, after the grime and exhaustion of campaign life, nothing compared to sinking into a steaming tub and feeling the tension drain from my muscles. I used to have my valet prepare these baths that were almost scalding hot. So hot that most men couldn't have endured them. But the heat felt like absolution. Like it was burning away not just the physical dirt, but the moral compromises, the difficult decisions, the weight of command that accumulated like sediment on my soul. Sometimes I would lie in those baths for an hour, letting my mind wander to memories of Corsica, of my childhood, of times when my biggest concern was whether I could afford new boots for military school. In the bath, I wasn't Emperor Napoleon, I was just a tired man seeking comfort. I think I ate quickly because eating slowly forced me to think about pleasure, and pleasure always reminded me of what I had sacrificed to achieve greatness. Better to wolf down my food and get back to work than to sit with the knowledge of how much of life's sweetness I had traded away for power and glory. The saddest part is that I trained myself so thoroughly to ignore physical pleasure that I lost the ability to enjoy it even when I had time. Even here on St. Helena, where I have nothing but time, I still eat quickly, still feel restless during meals, still feel guilty for any moment not spent in productive thought. I conquered Europe, but never learned to conquer my own impatience with the simple joys that make life worth living.
That restlessness you describe, it's heartbreaking. But speaking of things beyond conquest, what role did God play in your life? You signed the Concordat, but were you truly religious?
God. You ask me about the Almighty as if my relationship with divinity could be reduced to simple belief or disbelief. My connection to God was far more complex, far more pragmatic, and far more personal than any theologian would approve of. I was raised Catholic, of course. Corsican Catholicism, which is different from French Catholicism, which is different from Roman Catholicism. We believed in God, but we also believed in practical miracles. in the power of will to shape divine outcomes, in the idea that God helps those who help themselves with sufficient intelligence and determination. When I studied at military school, I encountered the philosophers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot. They taught me to question everything, including the existence of God. For a time, I thought myself an atheist, convinced that religion was merely a tool used by the powerful to control the weak. But then I experienced battle, real battle, where death and life hang on decisions made in seconds, where the impossible becomes routine, where you see men perform acts of courage that transcend human understanding. In those moments I felt something. Call it providence, call it destiny, call it the invisible hand that guides human affairs toward purposes we cannot fully comprehend. The Concordat wasn't born from religious conviction. It was born from political necessity and philosophical understanding. France needed spiritual healing after the revolutionary excess. You cannot govern a Catholic people by pretending their deepest beliefs are meaningless. You cannot unite a nation whilst declaring war on the faith that shaped its culture for 15 centuries. But signing the Concordat also reflected my growing understanding that religion serves purposes beyond superstition. It provides comfort to those who suffer, hope to those who despair, moral framework to those who might otherwise live without principles. Whether or not God exists, the idea of God makes people better than they would be without it. My personal relationship with divinity was more transactional. I prayed before every major battle. Not because I expected divine intervention, but because prayer focused my mind, clarified my intentions, reminded me that some outcomes lay beyond human control. I attended Mass regularly as emperor, not from devotion, but because ritual has power, ceremony has meaning, and leaders must respect the beliefs of those they serve. Did I believe in a personal God who watched over Napoleon Bonaparte? Sometimes. In my moments of greatest triumph, I felt guided by a force greater than myself. At Austerlitz, when everything unfolded exactly as I had planned, I sensed a cosmic approval of my actions. When I escaped from Elba and France welcomed me back, I felt blessed by something beyond mere luck. But I also believed in a God who demanded excellence, not the gentle, forgiving God of the New Testament, but the demanding, testing God of the Old Testament, who gave talents to be used, not buried. I saw my genius as a divine gift that carried divine responsibility. To waste my abilities would have been the greatest sin I could commit. The question of suffering always troubled my faith. If God was just, why did innocent people die in my wars? If God was merciful, why did children starve whilst their fathers fought for principles they barely understood? I never found satisfactory answers to these questions, but I found working answers. Perhaps God's justice operates on a scale too large for human comprehension. Perhaps temporary suffering serves purposes we cannot see. Here on St. Helena, approaching death, my relationship with God has become more urgent and more uncertain. If there is divine judgment waiting for me, how will I account for the blood on my hands? If there is no God, how do I accept that everything I achieved will ultimately mean nothing? I find myself praying more now than I have since childhood. Not for rescue, that would be beneath my dignity. Not for forgiveness, my actions were necessary, not sinful. I pray for understanding. I pray that if there is a divine plan, my role in it was worthy of the talents I was given. Religion, I've concluded, is like military strategy. It works best when you understand its purposes without becoming enslaved to its methods. I used God, as I used everything else, as a tool for achieving greatness. Whether God used me in return is a question I may soon have answered.
That spiritual wrestling is fascinating. But you mentioned your health is failing. Beyond the isolation, what's the physical reality of your condition here?
My body. Mon Dieu, you want to know about the slow torture of physical decline? About what it means when the vessel that carried your spirit through 20 years of glory begins to crack and leak and fail you when you need it most? The stomach pains began years ago, but here they've become constant companions. It feels like something is gnawing at me from the inside, sometimes sharp and sudden, sometimes a deep, aching burn that makes even breathing difficult. The British doctors claim it's nothing serious, just the effects of a sedentary lifestyle and rich food. But I know my own body, and this isn't natural aging. I suspect poison, not dramatic, theatrical poison from Gothic novels, but something more subtle, arsenic perhaps, administered slowly through the wallpaper, the wine, the very air of this place. It would be like the British to kill me gradually, to make my death seem natural, whilst ensuring I suffer every moment of it. The headaches are almost worse than the stomach pains. They begin behind my eyes and spread like fire through my skull, making thought itself agony. Ironic, isn't it? The mind that once commanded Europe reduced to a prison of pain, unable to focus on anything beyond the throbbing in my temples. My legs, which once carried me across battlefields from Spain to Russia, now struggle with the simple walk from my bedroom to my study. There are days when climbing the stairs leaves me breathless, when the short stroll to the garden becomes an expedition requiring careful planning and frequent rest. But the humiliation goes beyond mere discomfort. This body once inspired confidence in my soldiers, once commanded respect from kings and emperors. When I stood before the Grande Armée, when I reviewed troops or addressed civilians, my physical presence was part of my authority. I was compact but vital, energetic, radiating the kind of health that suggested invincibility. Now I catch glimpses of myself in mirrors and see a stranger, pale, bloated, moving like an old man, though I'm barely 50. My uniforms hang differently, my posture has changed, my very bearing announces weakness to anyone observant enough to notice. The worst part is how physical decline affects mental capacity. There are mornings when the pain is so intense that I cannot concentrate long enough to dictate my memoirs. Afternoons when fatigue overwhelms me so completely that I fall asleep in my chair like a doddering grandfather. Evenings when my hands shake too badly to write letters. I who prided myself on mental discipline, on the ability to think clearly under any circumstances, now find my thoughts clouded by discomfort, my reasoning compromised by exhaustion. Sometimes I begin a sentence and forget how I intended to end it. Sometimes I lose my train of thought completely, left staring at nothing whilst my companions exchange worried glances. Sleep, which once refreshed me completely in 4 or 5 hours, now brings no rest. I wake repeatedly through the night, sometimes from pain, sometimes from dreams so vivid they seem more real than my waking hours. I dream of battles I never fought, conversations I never had, victories that existed only in my sleeping mind. The irony is exquisite. I spent my entire adult life pushing my body beyond normal limits, demanding that it perform impossible feats of endurance. 20-hour days in the saddle, sleeping on frozen ground, eating whatever food was available, ignoring illness and injury because the empire required my constant attention. Now, when I finally have time to rest, when I could sleep 12 hours a day if I chose, my body refuses to cooperate. It's as if it's punishing me for decades of neglect, demanding payment for all those times I ignored its needs in service of greater ambitions. But perhaps this physical deterioration is fitting. Perhaps a man who caused so much suffering should experience suffering himself. Perhaps the body that housed such overwhelming ambition needed to be humbled, needed to learn the limitations that the spirit never accepted. I tell myself that Caesar died quickly, that Alexander died young, that most great men are spared the indignity of prolonged decline. But that's cold comfort when you're lying awake at 3 a.m, feeling your strength ebb away drop by drop, knowing that the machine that conquered Europe is finally, inevitably breaking down.
The pain you're describing is almost unbearable to witness. But if you could live your life again, knowing what you know now, what would you change?
Live it again? You ask me the cruelest question possible. To imagine having the wisdom I possess now, but the opportunities I had then. To think about all the moments when a different choice might have changed everything. The first thing I would change, and this will surprise you, is that I would marry for love from the beginning, and I would choose someone who could truly understand me. Not Josephine, much as I adored her, because she never shared my vision for what we could accomplish together. Not Marie-Louise, because that marriage was pure political calculation. Someone who could be my true partner, my intellectual equal, my companion in both triumph and defeat. I would choose a woman with the intelligence to grasp my plans, the strength to challenge my assumptions, the wisdom to moderate my extremes. Perhaps someone like Madame de Staël, if she hadn't been so insufferably superior. Someone who could love the man whilst respecting the emperor, who could provide the emotional anchor I desperately needed whilst supporting the great work we were attempting. Second, I would be more patient with my allies and more ruthless with my enemies. Too often, I gave second chances to people who didn't deserve them. Talleyrand, Fouché, even some of my marshals. I let sentiment override judgment, hoping that loyalty could be earned through kindness when it should have been enforced through strength. At the same time, I would eliminate my enemies more completely. After Austerlitz, I should have destroyed the Austrian monarchy entirely instead of allowing them to rebuild and fight again. After Jena, I should have dismantled Prussia permanently rather than giving them time to reform and seek revenge. Mercy, I learned too late, is often just cruelty delayed. Third, I would never have invaded Russia. Never. That decision haunts me more than any other because it was so clearly driven by ego rather than necessity. Alexander had broken the continental system, yes, but there were diplomatic solutions available. I chose war because I couldn't tolerate the idea that any European leader would dare defy me with impunity. If I had accepted the diplomatic humiliation, focused on consolidating my Western European empire, spent 5 years building infrastructure and institutions instead of chasing military glory in the Russian wasteland, I might have created something truly permanent. The empire might have survived my death, might have evolved into the peaceful European Federation I always envisioned. Fourth, I would delegate more authority and trust other people's expertise. My need to control every detail, to make every significant decision personally, created a system that couldn't function without me. When I was injured or absent, everything ground to a halt because no one else was authorized to act decisively. I should have created genuine institutions, not just extensions of my personal will. I should have trained successors, shared knowledge, built systems that could survive political transitions. Instead, I made myself indispensable, which guaranteed that my empire would die with me. Fifth, I would spend more time with my son. Much more time. I would teach him personally, play with him, show him that being his father mattered more to me than being emperor of the French. I would make sure he understood what I was fighting for, why the sacrifices were necessary, what kind of world I hoped to leave him. Maybe if he had really known me as a person, rather than just as a distant, powerful figure, he wouldn't have been so easily turned against my memory. Maybe if I had prioritized being a father alongside being an emperor, he would have grown up proud of his name instead of ashamed of it. Sixth, I would write more, not just military dispatches and government decrees, but books, essays, reflections on governance and human nature. I would ensure that my ideas survived independently of my political success, that future generations could understand what I was really trying to accomplish. I had insights about leadership, about human psychology, about the relationship between individual genius and social progress that died with my empire. If I had spent less time on ceremonial duties and more time documenting my thoughts, maybe the intellectual legacy would have been as strong as the legal legacy. But you know what I would not change? The fundamental ambition, the refusal to accept limitations, the determination to attempt the impossible. Because living safely, living within conventional boundaries, accepting that the world had to remain as I found it, that would not have been living at all. Better to have tried and failed magnificently than to have succeeded at something small. Better to have reached for godhood and fallen to earth than to have spent my life crawling on my belly, content with whatever scraps the existing order was willing to throw me. If I could live again, I would make it a better story, a wiser story, a more complete story, but it would still be a story worth telling.
That analysis of your perfect enemies is fascinating. But looking inward, beyond military defeats or political failures, what do you consider your deepest personal failure? This wasn't just a character flaw. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature that poisoned every relationship I ever had. I believed that if I could just explain myself clearly enough, if I could just demonstrate the logic of my positions convincingly enough, everyone would see what I saw and want what I wanted. But people aren't problems to be solved. They're not territories to be conquered or systems to be optimized. They have their own desires, their own fears, their own understanding of what constitutes a good life. My tragedy was that I never learned to work with human nature as it exists. I always insisted on working against it in service of what I believed it could become. Take my relationship with my son. Even now, even facing death, I catch myself planning what I would teach him if I saw him again. Not how to be happy or fulfilled or at peace with himself, but how to be worthy of the Bonaparte name, how to justify my legacy, how to complete my unfinished work. I cannot simply love him as he is. I love him as the symbol of everything I hoped to achieve, That's not fatherly love. That's imperial ambition disguised as paternal affection. I'm still trying to use the people I care about most to validate my own choices. With Josephine, I demanded emotional exclusivity whilst giving her none of the attention and tenderness that such exclusivity requires. I wanted her to be completely devoted to a man who was completely devoted to his empire. I expected her to find fulfillment in my achievements whilst offering her no real partnership in creating them. When she sought comfort elsewhere, when she found lovers who could give her what I wouldn't give her, I felt betrayed. But the real betrayal was mine. I betrayed the basic obligation of love, which is to prioritize the beloved's happiness over your own convenience. My mother saw this failing more clearly than anyone. She used to say, "Napoleon, you cannot love people the way you love your plans. People need to be accepted, not perfected." But I didn't listen. I thought maternal wisdom was too simple for someone attempting to reshape European civilization. The cruelest irony is that my inability to love people as they were made me less effective at the very things I sacrificed personal relationships to achieve. If I had understood human nature better, I would have been a better general, a better emperor, a better architect of social change. Instead of trying to force my marshals to think like me, I should have learned to think like them, to understand their strengths and limitations, their motivations and fears. Instead of demanding that conquered peoples immediately embrace French culture, I should have found ways to blend French principles with local traditions. But perhaps the most painful aspect of this failure is how it affected my relationship with myself. I became so focused on what I could accomplish that I lost touch with who I actually was. I stopped being Napoleon Bonaparte and became Napoleon the Project, a collection of ambitions and achievements rather than a human being with normal needs for friendship, relaxation, simple pleasures. I forgot how to be idle, how to enjoy conversation for its own sake rather than as a means of gathering information or advancing plans. I forgot how to appreciate beauty that served no strategic purpose, how to take pleasure in accomplishments that didn't advance my larger agenda. Even here, even now, when I have nothing left to accomplish and nowhere to go, I still struggle with simply being present in the moment. I still find myself treating every conversation as an opportunity to explain myself, every memory as evidence for my defense, every thought as preparation for some future justification. My deepest personal failure was that I never learned the difference between loving people and using them. I never learned that the greatest leaders are those who serve others rather than demanding that others serve them. I never learned that true strength comes from accepting your own vulnerability rather than denying it. If I could change one thing about my character, it wouldn't be to make myself more cautious or more diplomatic. It would be to make myself more genuinely loving, more capable of seeing others as ends in themselves rather than means to my ends. That failure cost me everything that made life worth living, long before it cost me my empire. The self-awareness you're showing is remarkable and heartbreaking. Based on everything you've experienced, what do you want people to understand about the nature of power? The most dangerous moment in any leader's life is when they start to believe that their power is natural, deserved, permanent. When you stop remembering that power is borrowed from the people you lead, that it can be withdrawn as quickly as it was granted, that it exists to serve purposes larger than your own ambitions. I began to think that my genius entitled me to make decisions for millions of people who had never asked for my guidance. I convinced myself that my vision was so superior that opposition to it was essentially treason against human progress itself. I forgot that the consent of the governed isn't just a political nicety, it's the foundation that makes any power legitimate and sustainable. Power corrupts not by making you evil, but by making you isolated. It surrounds you with people who benefit from agreeing with you, who profit from telling you what you want to hear, who rise in your service by reflecting your own opinions back to you in slightly different language. Gradually, you lose access to genuine feedback, authentic criticism, honest assessment of your policies and their effects. You begin to live in a bubble of manufactured approval, where every decision seems wise because no one dares to suggest that it might be foolish. The higher you rise, the more complete this isolation becomes. As emperor, I was surrounded by thousands of people every day, but I rarely encountered anyone willing to tell me uncomfortable truths. My courtiers competed to praise my brilliance. My ministers competed to implement my policies. My generals competed to execute my strategies. But who competed to correct my mistakes? Power also creates a terrible addiction to control. Once you've experienced the intoxication of bending reality to your will, of seeing your thoughts become laws and your wishes become facts, ordinary human relationships begin to feel frustrating and inefficient. Why should you have to persuade people when you can simply command them? Why should you have to compromise with others when your position is obviously superior? Why should you have to accept the slow pace of democratic deliberation when urgent problems demand immediate solutions? But this addiction to control ultimately makes you less powerful, not more. People who are commanded rather than persuaded will obey only as long as they must. Policies imposed rather than negotiated will be sabotaged by those forced to implement them. Changes decreed rather than evolved will be reversed the moment your authority weakens. The greatest leaders I've studied, Caesar, Alexander, Charlemagne, they all face the same fundamental choice: use power to serve something greater than themselves, or use it to serve their own vision of greatness. The difference between these options seems small, but the consequences are enormous. When you serve something greater than yourself, whether it's a set of principles, a vision of justice, or simply the welfare of your people, power becomes a tool with clear limitations and specific purposes. When you serve your own vision of greatness, power becomes an end in itself, demanding constant growth and eventually consuming everything you value. I thought I was serving human progress, French glory, European unity, noble goals that justified extraordinary means. But somewhere along the way, these abstract purposes became indistinguishable from my personal ambitions. I stopped asking whether my policies served France and started asking whether France served my policies. The most important lesson about power is that it must be consciously limited, deliberately constrained, voluntarily shared. Not because limitation makes you weaker, but because unlimited power inevitably destroys its own foundations. A leader who cannot be contradicted will eventually make contradictable mistakes. A ruler who cannot be replaced will eventually become someone who should be replaced. A system that depends entirely on one person's judgment will eventually encounter problems that exceed any individual's capacity to solve. If I could speak to every future leader, every person who will ever hold authority over others, I would tell them this: the moment you stop being afraid of your own power is the moment you become unfit to wield it. The moment you stop questioning your own decisions is the moment your decisions become questionable. Power should terrify those who hold it, not because it's evil, but because it's responsibility for consequences you cannot fully predict or control. The day you stop feeling the weight of that responsibility is the day you start destroying everything you work to build. Learn from my mistakes. Choose limitations before limitations are imposed upon you. Share power before power abandons you. Serve principles larger than yourself before you discover that serving yourself leads to losing everything that made service worthwhile. That wisdom about power is extraordinary, but you're often portrayed as ruthless, even cruel. Can you tell me about a time when you chose mercy over justice?
Mercy. You know, this may be the question that reveals more about my true character than any discussion of battles or politics, because mercy is the one virtue that serves no strategic purpose, offers no practical advantage, exists purely because someone chooses humanity over efficiency. The moment that haunts me most, and I mean that in the best possible way, happened during the campaign in Egypt. We had captured a group of Turkish prisoners after a particularly brutal siege. These men had fought with extraordinary courage, had inflicted serious casualties on my forces, had shown us no mercy when they had the advantage. According to the laws of war, according to the logic of deterrence, according to the advice of my subordinates, these prisoners should have been executed as an example to other enemies who might consider such determined resistance. It would have been practical, defensible, militarily sound. But as I walked through their makeshift prison, I saw something that stopped me cold. One of the prisoners, a young man, couldn't have been more than 17, was writing what I assumed was a final letter to his family. He was using a piece of charcoal on a scrap of cloth, working with intense concentration despite his shackled hands. Curiosity overcame me. I asked my interpreter to find out what he was writing. It wasn't a letter at all, it was a poem about his mother's garden in Anatolia, about the way pomegranate blossoms looked in spring sunlight, about how he hoped his younger sisters would remember his stories, about the French soldiers who fought like lions but showed honor even to their enemies. That boy was facing death, probably within hours, and he was using his final moments to create something beautiful, not to curse his captors or bewail his fate, but to celebrate the world he would soon leave. In that moment, I saw something that transcended nationality, religion, military necessity. I saw human dignity made manifest. I ordered their immediate release. Not exchange, not ransom, not negotiation, simple, unconditional release. My officers were appalled. Kleber argued that this would encourage other enemies to fight harder, knowing they might be spared. Murat warned that showing weakness would be interpreted as French uncertainty about our ultimate victory. They were probably right from a purely military standpoint, but they were absolutely wrong from every standpoint that actually mattered. Those prisoners returned to their units and told stories about French honor that did more to limit Turkish resistance than any number of executions could have achieved. More importantly, that act of mercy changed me. It reminded me that every enemy soldier was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's hope for the future. It reminded me that courage deserves respect regardless of which flag it serves under. But perhaps my greatest act of mercy was one that no historian has ever recorded, because it involved someone who never achieved fame or notoriety. During the retreat from Moscow, we encountered a group of Russian peasants who had been caught in the crossfire between our forces and Cossack raiders. Their village had been burned, their livestock killed, their winter stores destroyed. They were facing certain death from cold and starvation, but they were also terrified of French soldiers. They had heard stories about our supposedly barbaric treatment of civilians. I could have ordered my men to simply march past. We were already carrying wounded, already short of supplies, already racing against time and weather. Taking responsibility for Russian civilians would slow our retreat and reduce our own chances of survival. Instead, I ordered my personal guard to share their rations with these families. I gave up my own warm cloak to an elderly Russian woman whose grandchildren were shivering in the snow. I assigned some of our precious remaining horses to carry Russian children who couldn't keep pace with our desperate march. For 3 days, the Grande Armée, or what remained of it, protected and provisioned people who had every reason to hate us. French soldiers shared their last pieces of bread with Russian babies. Grenadiers who had conquered half of Europe spent their final reserves of strength carrying Russian invalids who would never live to thank them. Most of those peasants probably died anyway. The Russian winter was merciless to everyone, regardless of nationality or good intentions. But for 3 days, in the midst of one of history's greatest military disasters, we proved that human compassion could survive even the most desperate circumstances. Those acts of mercy didn't serve my strategic interests. They didn't advance my political goals. They didn't enhance my reputation or intimidate my enemies. They existed purely because, in certain moments, being human mattered more than being emperor. I think about these incidents more often than I think about my victories. Austerlitz made me famous, but showing mercy to Turkish poets and Russian peasants made me feel worthy of being remembered as something more than just another conqueror. The tragedy is that I didn't choose mercy often enough. I let practical considerations override humanitarian impulses far too many times. I told myself that hard decisions were necessary for greater goods, that individual compassion was a luxury I couldn't afford when entire civilizations hung in the balance. But mercy is never a luxury. It's what separates leadership from mere domination, what transforms power from a tool of oppression into an instrument of elevation. Every time I chose efficiency over mercy, I diminished not just my enemies, but myself. If I could add one chapter to the Code Napoleon, it would require every person in authority to regularly perform acts of mercy that serve no practical purpose beyond affirming human dignity. Because the moment leaders stop seeing those they govern as worthy of unearned compassion is the moment they forfeit the right to govern at all.
Those stories about mercy, they're beautiful and deeply moving. As someone who's lived such an extraordinary life, what do you believe makes any life truly meaningful? The most meaningful moments of my life weren't the grand ones that historians write about. They were quiet conversations with my mother about what kind of man I hoped to become. They were evenings with Josephine when she would tell me stories about her childhood, and I would forget temporarily that I was supposed to be reshaping European civilization. They were moments with my soldiers when I wasn't their emperor, but just another man sharing the hardships of campaign life, sitting around campfires, listening to them sing songs from their home provinces, watching them write letters to sweethearts who might never receive them. In those moments, I felt connected to something infinitely larger and more important than any empire. A meaningful life, I believe, is one lived in service to something that will outlast your individual existence. But that something doesn't have to be grand or historical. It can be as simple as raising children who will be kinder than you were, or teaching students who will surpass your own understanding, or creating beauty that will comfort strangers you'll never meet. What makes life meaningful is the decision to use whatever talents you've been given, not just for your own advancement, but for the elevation of others. Whether you're a peasant teaching your children to read, or an emperor establishing legal codes, the meaning comes from the service, not the scale. I spent most of my life believing that extraordinary people had obligations to attempt extraordinary things. I thought that being born with unusual abilities created a debt that could only be repaid through unusual achievements. But I now understand that the obligation is simpler and more profound, to use whatever gifts you have been given with wisdom, courage, and genuine care for the welfare of others. The tragedy of my life is that I confused impact with meaning. I achieved enormous impact. My actions changed the lives of millions of people, reshaped the map of Europe, influenced legal systems that still govern much of the world. But impact without wisdom, change without compassion, influence without love, these create noise, not meaning. Meaning requires humility. It requires the recognition that your individual story, however dramatic, is just one thread in a tapestry too vast for any person to comprehend fully. It requires accepting that your role is to weave your thread as beautifully as possible, not to control the entire pattern. I think about the Turkish boy writing poetry before what he thought would be his execution. His life had minimal historical impact. No one outside his immediate family would have remembered his name, but in choosing to create beauty in the face of death, in using his final moments to celebrate rather than curse, he achieved something more meaningful than most emperors ever manage. Meaning comes from the choice to remain human in circumstances that tempt you to become something less than human. It comes from choosing love over fear, creation over destruction, service over domination, even when those choices offer no practical advantage. A meaningful life is one that leaves the world slightly better than you found it, not necessarily in dramatic ways, but in real ones. whether that means raising children who are more compassionate than their generation typically produces, or creating laws that protect people you'll never meet, or simply treating others with more kindness than they have any right to expect. But perhaps most importantly, meaning comes from the courage to remain vulnerable, to keep your heart open to joy and pain alike, to refuse the temptation to protect yourself from suffering by refusing to care deeply about anything. I spent years trying to armor my heart against disappointment, betrayal, loss. I thought that emotional invulnerability was a necessary qualification for leadership. But cutting yourself off from pain also cuts you off from love, from wonder, from the very experiences that make existence worthwhile. The most meaningful life is not necessarily the most successful life, the most famous life, or even the most influential life. It's the most fully lived life, the life that embraces both joy and sorrow, achievement and failure, connection and solitude, as equally necessary parts of the human experience. If I could live again, I would still choose ambition, still choose to dream larger than seemed reasonable. But I would remember that the dream itself is less important than how you pursue it, who you become in the pursuit, and whether you remain worthy of the love that makes any dream worth achieving. The regret about choosing love, that's striking. You've ruled over millions of women, changed laws affecting them. What are your actual views on women and their capacity for power?
Women and power. You know, this is where my enemies would expect me to voice the conventional prejudices of my time, but I've known too many extraordinary women, seen too much female intelligence and strength to accept the comfortable lies that men tell themselves about the supposed inferiority of the feminine mind. My mother was the strongest person I've ever known. Letizia managed a household of 8 children with virtually no money, navigated the treacherous politics of revolutionary Corsica, and somehow found the resources to educate her sons for greatness. She possessed a kind of practical wisdom that surpassed any of my marshals, a strategic intelligence that most ministers would have envied. Josephine, for all her faults, understood people with an intuition that amazed me. She could read character at a glance, predict how individuals would react to different approaches, navigate social complexities that I found baffling. If she had been born male, she would have made a magnificent diplomat or spy master. Madame de Staël was perhaps the most intellectually formidable person in France, man or woman. Her mind could match mine in philosophical discussion, surpass it in literary analysis, challenge it in political theory. I exiled her not because she was wrong, but because she was often right in ways that threatened my authority. Even Marie-Louise, sweet and conventional as she was, displayed a kind of steady competence that kept the Regency functioning during my absences. She made decisions, managed ministers, handled correspondence with a reliability that I came to depend upon. The tragedy is that society wastes female intelligence on an almost criminal scale. Half the human race is trained from birth to suppress their ambitions, hide their capabilities, pretend to be less intelligent than they actually are. Meanwhile, we wonder why progress comes so slowly, why problems persist that fresh perspectives might solve. In the Code Civil, I granted women more legal rights than they had enjoyed under the old regime, but I also reinforced certain traditional limitations that I now believe were mistakes. I was trying to balance revolutionary innovation with social stability, but in doing so, I probably held back human development by decades. If women could compete for positions based purely on merit, if they could become generals, ministers, ambassadors, judges based on capability rather than gender, I believe the quality of governance would improve dramatically. Women think differently from men, and that difference is a strength, not a weakness. They're often more practical, less concerned with abstract glory, more focused on actual results. They're frequently better at negotiation, at building consensus, at understanding the human costs of political decisions. They're typically more interested in education, health, social welfare, the unglamorous but essential work of civilization. I've observed that women in power often govern more prudently than men. They're less likely to wage unnecessary wars, less susceptible to flattery, less prone to the kind of grandiose gestures that satisfy male ego but serve no practical purpose. Perhaps if more women had been involved in European politics, the continent wouldn't have needed to be drenched in blood for 20 years. But here's what I find most fascinating. Women adapt to powerlessness in ways that actually demonstrate their superior political intelligence. They learn to influence indirectly, to achieve their goals through persuasion rather than command, to build networks of loyalty that are often stronger than formal authority structures. Josephine wielded enormous influence over French society not through any official position, but through her understanding of fashion, culture, and social dynamics. She shaped public opinion, elevated careers, destroyed reputations, all without ever issuing a single decree. That's a more sophisticated form of power than most emperors ever achieve. The greatest limitation isn't female capacity, it's male insecurity. Most men cannot tolerate the idea that women might be their intellectual equals or superiors. They prefer to maintain systems that artificially limit female achievement rather than compete on level ground. I was guilty of this myself. Even when I recognized female excellence, I was uncomfortable with it. I exiled Madame de Staël partly because her brilliance made me feel defensive. I divorced Josephine partly because her independence threatened my need for control. If I were designing a government today, I would insist on genuine equality of opportunity, not because women deserve special consideration, but because any system that wastes half its human talent is systematically inefficient. A meritocracy that excludes women isn't a true meritocracy at all. The future belongs to societies intelligent enough to harness all their human resources. The nations that cling to artificial barriers based on gender, class, or birth will be surpassed by those brave enough to promote purely based on ability. And when that day comes, I suspect women will prove they were holding back their full capabilities all along.
Your views on female potential are remarkably progressive. But let's go back to simpler times. What are your favorite memories from childhood in Corsica?
Childhood in Corsica. Mon Dieu. You're asking me to remember when the world was still full of wonder instead of problems to be solved. When I was just Napoleone instead of Napoleon. When my biggest concern was whether I could climb the olive trees faster than my brother Joseph. My most treasured memory, I must have been 6 or 7 years old. My father had taken Joseph and me to the hills above Ajaccio to see where Pauli's men had made their final stand against the French. Whilst he told us stories about Corsican independence, about heroes who died for freedom, I wandered off and found a patch of wild strawberries hidden amongst the rocks. I ate until my stomach ached, my face and hands stained red with juice, completely lost in the simple pleasure of sweetness exploding on my tongue. When Papa found me, instead of scolding me for wandering off, he laughed and said, "That's my little general, always finding the hidden treasures." It was the first time anyone called me a general, even in jest. But what made that memory perfect wasn't the strawberries, or even Papa's laughter. It was the feeling of infinite possibility that surrounded everything. Standing on those hills, looking out over the Mediterranean, I felt like the whole world was spread before me, waiting to be explored. I didn't know about politics or war, or the crushing weight of responsibility. I just knew that somewhere beyond the horizon were adventures I couldn't even imagine. I loved our house in Ajaccio, that beautiful, chaotic place where 8 children somehow fitted into spaces that seemed impossibly small. My favorite spot was the little alcove under the stairs where I could hide with a book and pretend I was anywhere but Corsica. I read everything I could find, Caesar's commentaries, Plutarch's lives, even romantic novels that I would never admit to enjoying. Maman would find me there hours later, eyes red from reading by candlelight, completely lost in some ancient battle or distant kingdom. Instead of ordering me outside to play like other mothers might have done, she would bring me a piece of bread and cheese and say, "What are you conquering today, mon petit?" She understood even then that my mind needed feeding as much as my body. The games we played. Joseph and I would refight every famous battle we'd read about, using rocks for soldiers and sticks for cannons. I was always the attacker. I couldn't bear to be on the defensive. Couldn't stand the idea of just waiting for the enemy to make the first move. Even at 8 years old, I preferred impossible odds to guaranteed safety. We would stage elaborate sieges of imaginary fortresses, conduct diplomatic negotiations between toy armies, draw detailed maps of countries that existed only in our imagination. Lucian would sometimes join us, but he preferred to be the chronicler rather than the general. He would write epic accounts of our battles, complete with heroic speeches and tragic deaths. But perhaps my most precious memory involves my sister Elisa. She was the only one who could match me intellectually, the only one who wouldn't let me win arguments just because I was louder or more stubborn. We would debate everything: philosophy, religion, politics, literature. She taught me that being brilliant wasn't enough if you couldn't defend your ideas against equally brilliant opposition. One evening, we were arguing about whether great men create history or history creates great men. I was maybe 10 years old, she was 8, but we were discussing concepts that would challenge university professors. Papa listened from his chair by the fire, occasionally smiling at our intensity, never interrupting, even when our voices rose in passionate disagreement. Finally, Elisa said something that stopped me cold. Napoleon, maybe the greatest men are the ones who understand that they're both products of history and creators of it. Maybe the secret is knowing when to swim with the current and when to fight against it. Even now, that 8-year-old girl's insight influences how I think about leadership and destiny. What I miss most about childhood isn't the innocence. I was never truly innocent, always too serious, too ambitious, too aware of the wider world. What I miss is the sense that everything was possible, that no dream was too large, that failure was just a temporary setback before the next glorious attempt. In Corsica, I could be Caesar or Alexander or Charlemagne without anyone laughing at my ambitions. My family believed in me with the kind of absolute faith that makes miracles possible. They never told me to be realistic, never suggested that a boy from Corsica should limit his aspirations to what seemed achievable. Sometimes here on St. Helena, I close my eyes and try to transport myself back to those hills above Ajaccio. I try to recapture that feeling of standing at the edge of infinity, believing that somewhere beyond the horizon was a throne with my name carved on it. In those moments, just for a heartbeat, I'm not Napoleon the exile. I'm still Napoleon the dreamer, and the whole world is waiting for me to claim it.
The love in your voice when you speak of your family is beautiful. But your relationship with your brothers became quite complicated when you gained power. How did being emperor affect those family bonds?
But Joseph was never meant to be a king. He lacked the ruthless decisiveness that kingship requires, the willingness to make hard choices that would hurt people he cared about. In Spain, he tried to be loved rather than respected, and ended up being neither. He spent more time writing poetry than governing provinces, more time philosophizing than fighting guerrillas. Watching him struggle broke my heart because I could see that I had placed him in an impossible position. He wanted to please me, but he also wanted to be a good man according to his own conscience. Those two desires were often incompatible, and the conflict tore him apart. Lucian was perhaps the most naturally brilliant of all of us. A gifted orator, a sophisticated political thinker, someone who could have been my greatest ally or my most dangerous enemy. But Lucian had principles that wouldn't bend, convictions that couldn't be compromised. When I needed his support most, when I was trying to consolidate the consulate, he opposed me publicly over questions of republican virtue versus imperial necessity. We had terrible arguments, screaming matches where we said things that wounded each other permanently. I accused him of naive idealism, of valuing abstract principles over practical results. He accused me of betraying everything the revolution had stood for, of becoming the very type of tyrant we had fought to overthrow. The worst part was that we were both partially right. I was betraying certain revolutionary ideals, but I was doing it to save the essential gains of the revolution from its enemies. He was defending important principles, but he was doing it in ways that weakened our ability to protect those principles from external attack. Jérôme was the baby of the family, spoiled by everyone, charming but fundamentally unserious. When I made him king of Westphalia, I hoped responsibility would mature him, would transform the playboy into a statesman. Instead, he treated his kingdom like an elaborate game, spent enormous sums on parties and mistresses, whilst his subjects struggled with the costs of constant warfare. I wrote him letter after letter, trying to explain that kingship was a sacred trust, that the power I had given him came with obligations to the people under his rule. But Jérôme heard only criticism, never understanding. He saw my advice as interference, my expectations as impossible demands. Louis, who I made King of Holland, perhaps disappointed me most of all. He was supposed to be my representative, my voice in Dutch affairs, my guarantee that Holland would remain loyal to French interests. Instead, he went native. He became more Dutch than the Dutch themselves, more concerned with his subjects' welfare than with supporting my continental system. When I ordered him to close Dutch ports to British trade, he found excuses and delays. When I needed Dutch troops for my campaigns, he pleaded poverty and local concerns. He forgot that his crown was a gift from me, not a right inherited from God. The tragedy is that I understand their perspectives better now than I did then. They were caught between impossible loyalties, to me as their brother and emperor, to their subjects as kings, to their own consciences as men trying to do right in a world where every choice seemed to require moral compromise. But understanding doesn't eliminate the pain. These were the people who shared my childhood dreams, who knew me before I became a symbol rather than a person. They were supposed to be my partners in reshaping Europe, my collaborators in building something that would outlast all our individual lives. Instead, they became sources of constant frustration, political liabilities that I couldn't eliminate because they were family, reminders that even absolute power couldn't guarantee the loyalty of the people who should have loved me unconditionally. The loneliness of command was made worse by the distance it created between me and my brothers. They stopped seeing me as Napoleone and started seeing me as the emperor, someone to be pleased or appeased or occasionally defied, but never simply loved. By the end, we were strangers who happened to share the same parents. And that loss, that transformation of the people who had known me best into people who barely knew me at all, that was one of the prices of greatness that I never anticipated and never learned to bear gracefully.
The pain of losing family connections to power, it's devastating. But speaking of enemies, you've spent your final years as a prisoner of the British. What do you really think of them as a people?
The British. You want me to discuss my captors, my eternal enemies, the people who have made my final years a living hell? Very well. But I'll give you the truth, not the propaganda that either side would prefer. I hate them and I admire them in equal measure. They are my perfect opposite. Everything I am not, everything I could never become, everything that made them my most dangerous adversaries. Where I am direct, they are subtle. Where I am passionate, they are calculating. Where I seek to transform, they seek to preserve. Where I believe in the power of individual genius to reshape reality, they believe in the wisdom of institutions that evolve slowly over centuries. Their greatest strength is also their greatest weakness. They think in decades, whilst I thought in months. They planned the destruction of my empire, not through any single brilliant strategy, but through patient, methodical application of their superior resources. They understood that they didn't need to defeat me quickly. They just needed to outlast me. Wellington is the perfect embodiment of British character. Competent, steady, unimaginative, and absolutely unshakable. At Waterloo, he didn't outmaneuver me through tactical brilliance. He simply refused to break under pressure, held his ground when a more creative general might have retreated, and waited for Blücher to arrive. It was British victory through British virtues. Determination without inspiration, courage without flair. But I must acknowledge their political genius. They understood something I never fully grasped, that lasting power comes not from individual brilliance, but from creating systems that function regardless of who leads them. Their parliament, their legal traditions, their commercial networks, these institutions survive changes of government, economic crises, even military defeats. They built an empire through commerce rather than conquest, through influence rather than occupation. Where I tried to impose French law and French culture on conquered territories, they were content to let local customs persist as long as local profits flowed to London. It was more subtle, more sustainable, and ultimately more successful than my approach. Their treatment of me here on St. Helena reveals both their greatest strength and their deepest hypocrisy. They are masters of maintaining moral superiority whilst committing moral crimes. They present my imprisonment as necessary for European peace, conveniently ignoring that they're slowly killing a defeated enemy who poses no threat to anyone. Hudson Lowe, my jailer, embodies everything petty and vindictive about British character. He follows his instructions with the mindless precision of a clockwork automaton, never questioning whether humiliating a former emperor serves any useful purpose. He represents British bureaucracy at its worst, rule following without wisdom, authority without magnanimity. Yet I cannot deny their courage. They fought me for 20 years, faced defeat after defeat, saw their allies crushed and their plans destroyed, but they never surrendered. They understood that some contests are worth any sacrifice, that some principles are worth defending, even when defeat seems inevitable. Their navy was magnificent. I'll grant them that freely. On land, I could outfight any army in Europe, but on the seas, they were masters. Their admirals thought like I thought, took risks like I took risks, understood that bold action often succeeds where careful planning fails. Nelson at Trafalgar was pure genius, reckless, brilliant, and perfectly executed. What frustrates me most about the British is their talent for making their narrow interests appear to be universal principles. They fought me not for the freedom of Europe, but for the preservation of British commercial dominance. They supported absolute monarchies not from love of legitimate government, but because constitutional monarchy in France might have been more dangerous to them than Napoleonic tyranny. Yet they convinced the world, and perhaps themselves, that they were fighting for liberty against despotism, for justice against aggression, for civilization against barbarism. Their propaganda was so effective that even now, even here, even facing death, I sometimes wonder if they were right about me. But here's what I respect most about them. They won. Not through superior virtue or divine favor, but through superior strategy consistently applied over decades. They identified me as their greatest threat and dedicated their entire national resources to destroying me. They spent treasure they didn't have, formed alliances with enemies they despised, fought battles they couldn't afford to lose, all because they understood that Napoleon Bonaparte represented an existential challenge to everything they valued. That kind of clarity of purpose, that willingness to sacrifice everything for a single objective, these are qualities I understand and admire, even when they are directed against me. If I had been born British, I might have been another Wellington, competent, successful, but ultimately forgettable. If Wellington had been born French, he might have been another Napoleon, brilliant, transformative, but ultimately tragic. We were perfect enemies because we represented irreconcilable visions of human possibility. I believed that individual genius could reshape the world through force of will. They believed that collective wisdom expressed through established institutions could outlast any individual genius. History suggests they were right, but I still believe my vision was more beautiful.
That reflection on meaning is beautiful and wise. For young people today who have great ambitions but are looking at your story, what advice would you give them?
Your talents, whatever they may be, are not evidence of your superiority. They are evidence of your responsibility. You have been given unusual abilities not to prove your worth, but to serve purposes larger than your own advancement. The greater your gifts, the greater your obligation to use them wisely and humbly. Second, choose your enemies carefully, but choose your friends even more carefully. I spent enormous energy defeating people who opposed me, but I didn't spend enough energy understanding people who supported me. I knew how to conquer rivals, but I never learned how to truly collaborate with allies. Surround yourself with people who will tell you uncomfortable truths, not comfortable lies. Seek out advisors who will challenge your assumptions, not just implement your decisions. Find friends who love you enough to risk your anger by questioning your judgment. The most dangerous people in your life will not be your obvious enemies. They'll be the ones who benefit from your mistakes, who profit from your poor decisions, who rise in your service by telling you what you want to hear rather than what you need to know. Third, learn to fail gracefully whilst you still have time to recover from failure. I was so terrified of defeat that I avoided taking risks that might have taught me valuable lessons. When I finally did fail, catastrophically, at Waterloo, I had no experience with failure, no skills for handling defeat, no framework for learning from mistakes. Failure is not the opposite of success, it's a necessary component of success. Every significant achievement requires you to attempt things that might not work, to risk looking foolish in pursuit of something magnificent. But you must fail forward, not just fail. Study your failures more carefully than your successes. Successes can be attributed to luck, circumstances, or other people's efforts. But failures are usually yours alone, and they reveal precisely where your understanding needs improvement. Fourth, never sacrifice your capacity for love on the altar of your ambitions. I thought that emotional detachment made me stronger, that caring less about individuals would help me serve humanity more effectively. I was wrong. The ability to love deeply, even when that love makes you vulnerable, is not a weakness to be overcome. It's a strength to be cultivated. Love your family, love your friends, love your work, love your principles. But remember that love requires presence, attention, genuine care for the beloved's welfare above your own convenience. Don't make my mistake of assuming that people will understand why your grand purposes must take precedence over their immediate needs. Fifth, build institutions, not just personal achievements. Everything I accomplished was so tied to my individual presence that it crumbled when I was no longer there to maintain it. If you want your contributions to outlast your lifetime, create systems that can function without you, principles that can guide others after you're gone. Think beyond your own career, your own legacy, your own recognition. Ask yourself, what would I want to exist 50 years from now, and how can I help build it? The greatest leaders are those who make themselves unnecessary by creating something larger and more durable than their personal authority. Sixth, remember that power is a tool, not a destination. Seek power only to accomplish specific purposes, and surrender it when those purposes have been achieved or when you're no longer the best person to pursue them. Power corrupts not because it's evil, but because it's addictive. The longer you hold it, the harder it becomes to imagine life without it. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, stay curious about your own motivations. Ask yourself regularly, am I doing this because it needs to be done, or because I need to be the one doing it? The difference between service and ego is often subtle, but the consequences are enormous. I wish someone had told me these things when I was young and certain that my intelligence was sufficient to navigate any challenge. Intelligence is necessary for great achievement, but wisdom is necessary for great living, and wisdom comes not from success, but from honest reflection on the full range of human experience. Dream boldly, act courageously, fail gracefully, love deeply, serve humbly. Do these things, and whether or not you change the world, you will become worthy of whatever world you inherit. The young Napoleon Bonaparte thought he could conquer death by achieving immortality through fame. The old Napoleon Bonaparte knows that you conquer death by living so fully, so meaningfully, so lovingly, that death becomes just another transition rather than an ending. Be ambitious, yes, but be human first, and let your humanity guide your ambition rather than the reverse. That is the lesson that cost me everything to learn, and the gift I can give to those wise enough to learn it more cheaply than I did.
That advice, it feels like a father speaking to his children. But as we approach the end of our conversation, what is your single greatest regret?
My greatest regret. You want me to choose just one thread from this tapestry of mistakes, one decision from decades of choices that led to this island, this exile, this slow death so far from everything I loved? It's not what people would expect. It's not Moscow, though that was a disaster. It's not divorcing Josephine, though that broke both our hearts. It's not even Waterloo, though that ended everything I had built. My greatest regret is that I never learned how to be still. I never learned how to simply exist without constantly doing, achieving, conquering, building, changing. I never discovered the peace that comes from being present in a single moment without needing that moment to serve some larger purpose. From the time I was a child, reading about Caesar and Alexander, I was always racing toward the next goal, the next victory, the next transformation I could impose upon the world. I lived my entire life in the future, planning campaigns that hadn't begun, envisioning empires that didn't yet exist, working toward achievements that always seemed just beyond my current reach. But what did I miss whilst I was racing toward tomorrow? What conversations went unheard because I was mentally composing letters to ministers? What moments of simple beauty passed unnoticed because I was calculating military logistics? What opportunities for human connection were lost because I was always thinking 3 moves ahead? I regret that I never sat in a garden and watched flowers grow, just for the pleasure of watching them grow. I regret that I never spent an entire day with my son doing nothing more important than teaching him to skip stones or catch butterflies. I regret that I never told Josephine she was beautiful without also thinking about how her appearance would affect diplomatic negotiations. I regret that when my mother would tell me stories about her childhood in Corsica, I was usually thinking about how to apply her lessons to current political problems instead of simply enjoying the sound of her voice, the warmth in her eyes, the privilege of sharing her memories. The cruel irony is that this inability to be present, this compulsive need to turn every experience into preparation for future achievements, actually made me less effective at the very things I was so desperate to accomplish. If I had been more attentive to the people around me, I would have been a better judge of character. If I had been more present in conversations, I would have gathered better intelligence. If I had been more aware of my own emotional state, I would have made fewer decisions driven by unconscious fears and desires. But beyond its practical costs, this restlessness, this inability to find peace in the present moment, robbed me of the very experiences that make life worth living. I achieved everything I thought I wanted, but I never learned how to enjoy anything I achieved. Even here, even now, facing death on this isolated rock, I still catch my mind racing toward plans and projects I'll never have the chance to implement. I still find myself treating our conversation as an opportunity to shape my legacy rather than simply sharing honest thoughts with another human being. I regret that I lived my entire life as if it were a rough draft for some future perfect version that I was constantly working toward. I treated each day as preparation for more important days that were always just around the corner. But there are no more important days. There are only the days you actually live, and you can only live them once. If I could send one message back to my younger self, it wouldn't be strategic advice about military campaigns or political alliances. It would be this: stop. Right now, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, stop and notice where you are. Notice who is with you. Notice how the light falls across the room, how the air feels against your skin, what emotions are moving through your heart at this exact moment. Because this moment, this present, imperfect, unrepeatable moment, is the only one you actually possess. Everything else is memory or imagination. I conquered Europe, but I never conquered my own restlessness. I mastered the art of war, but I never mastered the art of peace. I learned how to reshape nations, but I never learned how to simply be happy with what I had already accomplished. That is my greatest regret. Not any specific decision or action, but a fundamental way of being that prevented me from ever truly inhabiting my own life. I was always Napoleon Bonaparte becoming something else. Never Napoleon Bonaparte simply being who he was in the present moment. And now, when I finally have no choice but to be still, when there are no more worlds to conquer and no more futures to race toward, I discover that stillness is not emptiness. It's fullness. It's the space where everything I was too busy to notice has been patiently waiting for my attention. Too late. Always too late.
I'm genuinely speechless. When we began this conversation, I thought I was interviewing a historical figure about his conquests and defeats. But what I witnessed instead was a man laying bare his soul, showing us not just the emperor but the human being beneath the legend. What strikes me most profoundly is how your story transcends its historical moment. Your struggles with loneliness, your desperate love for people who couldn't fully love you back, your terror of being forgotten, your pride in work that outlasted your political power. These aren't the concerns of a distant historical figure. These are the universal experiences of anyone who has ever dared to dream beyond their circumstances. You've shown us that greatness and failure aren't opposites, they're dance partners. That the same ambition that lifts us to impossible heights can also drive us to devastating lows. That being right isn't always the same as being wise, and that even the most brilliant among us remain heartbreakingly human. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Tea with Tyrants and Heroes. Next week, we'll be travelling back through time once again to share tea with another mysterious figure from history. Someone whose story will surprise you in ways you never expected. Until then, sleep well, knowing that you are held by love that transcends time itself.